All right, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to conclude the critique of substance dualism. The video, this will be the second part of the video that I did about a month ago, where I responded to Faith Because of Reason, or David Pallmann's video presenting a defense of substance dualism. So in the previous video, I went through the four main arguments that he presented in favor of substance dualism and provided a critique and response to those. In this video, I'm going to be responding to his responses to objections to substance dualism. I'm providing my commentary on that and also provide a bit of summary. David has agreed to come on my channel, or maybe we'll stream to both channels, and discuss our respective views. So that will be exciting. We'll set that up after I put out this second part to my response here. So hence why I'm finally getting to this now. Okay, so let's begin and just remind ourselves of what position we're talking about here. So substance dualism, the position that's defended by David. So this is a definition that he provides from the source here. So what we're talking about here is the position that a human is comprised of a body and a soul. The soul is some kind of immaterial spiritual substance, and it has an existence outside of and independent of the body, but somehow interacts with the body to produce, a human being. And as it says here, the mental life of the person is possessed and unified by the soul. The arguments that were presented by David that I responded to in the previous video were the argument from introspection. So this is an appeal to alleged differences in the properties between mental and physical objects. There was a argument from the unity of the self over time, which is said to only be explicable by the existence of an enduring immaterial self. Then there is the modal argument, which is, or the zombie argument, which is essentially a conceivability argument for the possibility of zombies, so basically bodies without minds or without consciousness, which implies that physicalism is false. And then the fourth one was the knowledge argument, which is the argument that certain types of experiential knowledge can only be explained by appealing to some sort of facts beyond physical facts. So that's the Mary colorblind scientist thought experiment, if you're familiar with that. Anyway, so if not, consult the previous video because I went through all of those arguments there. Here I'm going to respond to David's responses to various criticisms that have been leveled against substance dualism. So let's get going. So we begin with what he calls the unintelligibility objection. So quote here, there has been objected that on close examination, souls, immaterial minds, are shown to be unintelligible. The nature of such souls cannot be described unless they're described negatively. So the idea is that an immaterial mind or a soul can only be defined in terms of what it isn't, like it's not physical, for example, or it doesn't, it's not made up of anything. It doesn't have parts. So this is the idea that it's simple. So that's the first objection, that they can only be defined negatively. The second part of this objection is that Cartesian souls lack a principle of individuation. This is something we'll be talking about more in subsequent objections because it relates to the pairing problem. But the idea here is that what is it that makes two different souls distinct from each other? Any physical object will have, at the very least, a location in time and space. And so you can differentiate them based on where they are, in addition to their other physical properties that will vary. But Cartesian souls don't occupy places, according to this conception at least, and also they don't have physical properties. So what is it that makes them different from each other? It's sort of hard to understand that. So that's the essence of the objection there. So what does David say in response to this? So first, he says that two immaterial entities, or two souls, which are indistinguishable from a third-person perspective, might be distinguishable from a first-person perspective. Let me just check here if he goes into more detail about this. I don't think he does. Yeah, okay, so that's the second part. And I think that so what David's appealing to here is the idea that there are first-person experiential perspectives, or facts of the matter, perhaps, that are different between different souls. So each represents a different like perspective or viewpoint on as it interacts with the world. Um, I've never quite understood, or I don't quite understand how this really objects to the problem, because if something is supposed to be objective, meaning that its existence is not dependent on anyone's opinion or experiences or like mental states, like subjective mental states, then there should be third person perspective facts of the matter about that thing. So if immaterial souls are objectively real and exist in the world, then there should be, from my point of view, there should be third person facts of the matter, like objective facts of the matter, to about them, like in terms of what distinguishes them. So to say that there are only first person perspective facts of the matter, to me, is sort of an implicit retreat to saying that the souls, in some sense, aren't objectively real, or at least I see that as a tension in that response. But anyway, moving to the second response, which I think is what he mainly focuses on, is that material objects are no easier to individuate than immaterial entities. So let's see what he has to say about that. Oops, to my slides here. So he's a philosopher that's quoting, "The identity and differentiation of physical objects is one of the perennial problems in philosophy, regarding which there is no consensus view, even among contemporary philosophers." So, for example, when asked what is a physical object, then he thinks that the best response is to say, well, I don't know exactly, but I know one when I see one. And what he's talking about here is something that I mentioned in response to the identity of selves or persons over time, that argument, the idea that there needs to be some kind of fact of the matter that preserves the identity of each person over time. And that must be a immaterial substance or entity of some kind, because there are no physical objects or entities that can serve that role. Because whenever you have a physical object, it always, any type of physical object changes many of its properties over time. It loses matter, it gains matter, whether you're looking at the cellular level for living organisms, or like the atomic level for other types of, well, for any other type of life, for any other type of entity. The point is that any composite object is constantly changing its constituent parts and other properties as well, like it's moving through space, and it's maybe changing appearance or changing mass and all sorts of things. And so the question is, what properties make, in virtue of what does a single entity maintain its identity over time? And as is indicated in the slide here, in this quote, this is a problem for any type of physical object, that you need a theory of identity conditions over time, and what is it that makes something one object versus two different objects. This is the ship of Theseus and all that stuff. Again, we talked about this in the previous video. So it's true that this is a sort of an open philosophical question. So the response here is effectively to say, well, look, this is a broad problem for any type of entity, any type of composite entity, which is true. But then the sort of second part of the response here is to say that, so this guy sees no problem in allowing similar maneuvers for a dualist with respect to the notion of non-physical substance. That is, we don't know exactly what differentiates two different souls, for example, but we know them when we see one, and we can recognize them even if we can't specify exactly how it's all supposed to work. So the effective answer is to say that there is no answer, but that's good enough, because physicalists don't have better answers either. If we look at, okay, yeah, that's actually the next part there. So this is mostly in response to the objection about properties of individuation. So what is it that makes one soul distinct from a different soul? And this doesn't, the problem with this, well, among the problems with this response, one is that it doesn't seem to address the point made in a previous slide, that at least physical objects have properties of location that allow them to be differentiated from one another. But at least traditionally understood, a soul or an immaterial mind does not exist in a location. And so you don't even have that to appeal to. Two different physical objects at the very least are in different locations, but souls don't have a location. So what is it that can even appeal to their differences? We don't. That's separate from the question of continuity over time. So we might have a theory about how a composite object maintains its identity over time, or maybe we reject the notion of identity over time, and we think that it's some other relation, like continuity, for example, or causal relations. I mean, that's open as well. But the thing is, the substance dualist is the one usually who's wedded to the idea of strict identity conditions, because they want to say that an immaterial mind or soul is a simple object that endures over time. The materialist doesn't have to accept that. They can just deny that anything does that. Even physical simples like electrons, you could argue, don't actually endure like that. That's not actually how the world is. We should think of time and space as linked together in four-dimensional space-time, and actually there's just sort of particular facts of the matter about the configuration of physical states here and there. This is a sort of a Humean view, right? So we reject the notion of like enduring identity conditions of objects, simple or composite. So the physicalist is at liberty to do that. The dualist, it seems, isn't, because they are committed to the idea of a single, simple, enduring, immaterial self. And if that's true, they need to specify the identity conditions that differentiate these selves or these souls. And it seems that they just don't have anything to appeal to, because in addition to all the other problems, immaterial souls don't even have a physical location, so that they don't even have that to appeal to. So it seems to me that the physicalist has much more flexibility in their response, because they don't have to affirm the sort of things that the substance dualist has to affirm to, namely that there are distinct immaterial minds or souls that are separate from one another and distinct from one another, that are identical to each other, that each of which is identical to itself over time and endures over time. The physicalist doesn't have to say that about any type of physical system, so there's not a parity there. And the physicalist always has, at the very least, spatial and temporal location to appeal to, whereas it seems that the dualist doesn't have that with respect to immaterial minds. So I don't think this is a very convincing response. It seems to me that there is a significant problem here. Now, there's another aspect to the so that, confusingly, that relates to this second point here about the principle of individuation. So what is it that makes one Cartesian soul different from another? And we've seen that it seems like there's not really anything that can be appealed to, because each soul is supposed to be simple. All right. So what properties are there supposed to be that differentiate them? Can't be location even, or what else is it supposed to be? That's the one we just looked at. The first objection here relates to simply like, well, how can we describe them? What can we say about them? We can only describe them negatively, it seems, by saying what they aren't. This point here sort of responds to that as well, because it says, well, I don't know how to describe it, but I know one when I see one. I don't find that very satisfactory. There's a lot we can say about the nature of physical matter, even if we don't know exactly how to answer all philosophical questions about it. We know a great deal about it, a great deal more than anyone knows about immaterial minds. So I reject that comparison there. The second point, though, let's dive into this a bit deeper here. So regarding the idea that it's impossible to say anything non-negatively about the nature of immaterial souls. So as far as I'm aware, there's four main views that have been defended in the literature about the nature of an immaterial mind. So the first one is sometimes called the ectoplasm view. And this is the idea that a soul is comprised of, like, a soul is supposed to be a substance, right? A substance dualism. It's a substance that's not a physical substance. So, like, what is the nature of that substance? What can we say about it? What properties does it have? The ectoplasm view says that it's some type of non-material substance that's kind of like physical matter, but isn't physical matter. It's different. It's like this ectoplasm thing. And as far as I know, this view is not really much defended at all, because it's sort of hard to make sense of the idea that this substance is kind of like physical matter, but isn't at the same time. Ectoplasm just seems like an exotic type of matter. Maybe that we don't fully understand scientifically, or doesn't fit into our existing physical theories, but still seems to be just kind of like any other physical matter. And so this is probably not going to work to achieve the role that substance dualists want for an immaterial substance. So this view is not widely accepted. Now, the bundle view, this is sort of related to Hume's view about the nature of self. So Hume denied that there was a sort of singular thing called the self, right? He says that all there really is a bundle of of ideas or of mental sensations and perceptions and thoughts and so forth that are connected to each other in complicated ways. This is what really makes up a person. Now, you can have a sort of a bundle view of the self, regardless of whether you're a physicalist or a non-physicalist. It's just that if you're a physicalist, you're going to think that this bundle of mental properties ultimately has a physical substrate. But you could, at least potentially, have a dualist conception of the bundle theory of self. That is, you think that all there is to a person is the bundle of their mental properties, so like their memories and psychological characteristics and perceptions and beliefs and all that stuff, and they're kind of like all bundled together somehow. This could be a way to differentiate different souls from each other, because each bundle would be different, right? It would consist of different mental states or mental phenomena, mental properties. Now, the problem with the bundle view, though, is that, as far as I know, again, not many substance dualists defend this. Maybe some idealists do, but substance dualists typically reject this because the bundle view is inconsistent with the idea that a self is a singular and a simple immaterial substance that endures over time. Because the bundle view is the idea that there's this bunch of different mental states or characteristics, beliefs and ideas and perceptions and so on, and they're changing all the time. So there'll be continuity of them, but they're not going to be simple, because there's many different ones, right? And they're all related in this complex way. They're changing, so they're not going to be simple, and they're not going to endure over time. So many of the key arguments for substance dualism are reliant on this notion of the soul being simple, or ultimately simple, not composed of parts, and having this being able to endure over time. So generally, substance dualists are not going to be too happy with this sort of bundle view, or this dualist version of the bundle view of the self. So I actually think that's the most plausible theory, but generally dualists don't defend that, as far as I'm aware. So then there's the consciousness view. The consciousness view says that the substance of which souls or immaterial minds are made is just consciousness. Like, consciousness in some sense is itself a substance. There's quite a few problems with this view, and one of the most obvious being that it seems that immaterial minds or self, souls, whatever language we're going to use, continue to exist even when we're unconscious. And indeed, there's many aspects of thought that are below our conscious level as well. So there seems to be a lot more to a mind than just the conscious parts of mind. So if we say that what it is to be an immaterial mind is to be consciousness, or like consciousness is in some sense the substance of an immaterial mind, then we can't really explain how people maintain their identity across periods of unconsciousness. Nor can we understand how all of the subconscious or non-conscious mental activity fits into that. And I think it's also just a bit unclear how consciousness can be like a substance. That just sort of doesn't seem right to me. But anyway, there's enough problems with that view such that, as far as I know, the overwhelming view of substance dualist is this sort of fourth view, the no analysis view. I mean, it's not really a view. It just says, look, it's basically what was presented here. Look, we can't define in positive terms what an immaterial soul is or an immaterial mind. We can only say that it's not material and that it's simple, it doesn't have parts, and it's the unifying substrate of consciousness and mental life and so forth. We can say a few things that it's in terms of what it's not, and the vague sort of role that it's supposed to play, like that it unifies. What was the phrase that it was said here? Unifies mental life, whatever that means exactly. And sort of that's all we can say about it. Otherwise, we're just sort of appealing to examples. Like, well, I don't know exactly what an immaterial mind is, but I know it when I see it, or non-physical substance. So the no analysis view is basically, from my point of view, it's giving up. It's saying, look, we can't actually say anything about what a soul is. We can just say what it isn't, and then that's sort of the best we can do. Now, I think that's a very unsatisfactory response. I think that it's indicative of the fact that substance dualism is a completely useless explanatory theory with respect to the mind, because it doesn't tell us anything about the mind. All it is a box with a label on it saying substance dualism, and you just put all of the properties or features that you want minds or people to have in this box. Like, you want them to be identical to themselves over time. So you put that enduring over time sort of aspect in the box. You want them to be simple, ultimately simple, so you put that in the box. You want there to be sort of special non-physical properties of consciousness or whatever, so you put that in the box. You want it to be this sort of unifying feature of mental life, so you put that in the box. And so on and so forth, right? And there's no actual theory of anything here. It's just a specification of like what I've heard called as sort of a metaphysical desiderata, like a shopping list of things that you want it to have, but you don't actually explain how your theory enables it to have those properties. You just say that it has those properties. So I think the unintelligibility objection is probably one of the strongest responses to substance dualism. Basically, that substance dualism just isn't a theory. It's just a wish list of things that, based on intuition mostly, that and certain thought experiments, that people think mind should have certain properties, and so they've thrown a whole bunch of them together into a box and labeled it substance dualism, but there's no actual theory there. Now, it's true that physicalism is not a complete theory of the mind, or I mean, there's versions of it, physicalism. There's philosophical and scientific problems. But as I've argued in the previous video, in this video, and sort of elsewhere, we actually have very extensive answers to all of those questions. They're not complete and comprehensive, but there's a lot we can say. Like if you ask, well, what is a physical mind? Well, it's like the activity of the brain. Well, what is the brain? Well, it's neurons and neural networks and neurotransmitters and glial cells and so forth that organize in a certain way through development and learning. And here's how learning works, and neuroplasticity, and here's computational models of that, and his experimental evidence. And like, I could talk for hours and hours about all the things we know, as well as different philosophical theories about like nature of mental representations and so forth, and responses to mereological issues of how composite objects maintain identity over time, and on and on and on, right? There's so much to say there. And the reason that there's so much to say is because physicalism is actually grounded in scientific theory and experimental evidence. And so there's actually parts there that you can talk about how they interact and the mechanisms. You can actually theorize about them. Whereas substance dualism, there's just nothing. What do you say about it? All you say is what it doesn't, is the properties that it doesn't have or how it differs. It's like not like anything physical. I literally never read anything from a substance dualist that says anything positive about how literally anything in their theory is supposed to work. It's all arguments for it, for substance dualism, by saying that we think mind should have this property and it can't have it under physicalism, so it must be substance dualism. And I think this is just a terrible way of going about philosophy, and hence why I think the unintelligibility objection is a strong objection to substance dualism. Welcome. Okay, now we're moving on to the second argument against substance dualism, called the interaction problem. And this is one of the probably most well-known ones. Objections, that is. So here's a... So the basic concern here is, if we have two things, a physical body and an immaterial mind or immaterial soul, how is it that the immaterial soul interacts with the physical body? So if we think that they're causally related in some way, there's an interaction between them, we need to be able to specify how that happens, at least in general terms. Again, not every detail, but we have, I think it's reasonable to ask for some general theory about how this is supposed to work. And it just sort of seems hard on the face of it to imagine how much this might be possible. And we can make that initial intuition more precise. So here's one articulation. So today we know that emotions are physical states, the process of information about an organism in relation to its environment. These emotional processes are realized by specific neural circuits mediated by neurotransmitters, hormones, cellular messengers. Drugs affect this, electrical brain stimulation, anatomical lesions in the brain. Lesions, it's not how you spell lesions. And we can also see from electrophysiological imaging, fMRI and EEG and other studies about the physical processes that underlie emotional changes and the relationship between the mental states changing and the underlying physical substrate changing. So given that we know scientifically that there's this strong connection between mental states and physical states, and very clearly appears to be a causal connection, exactly how is, or even approximately how, is an immaterial soul supposed to fit into this? So here's Armstrong talking about this. We have no clear model for the way that spiritual happenings, soul happenings, give rise to brain happenings and vice versa. So how do they affect each other? How do they interact with each other? Okay, so there's an agreement here, right, from Armstrong here that, yeah, we don't have a clue how we can explain that. But here's a response. That isn't Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, misread this. So Descartes says, well, we can know that something is happening even if we don't know how it's happening. And I believe David later makes the same point as well. So then Armstrong here is saying that is no reply if what we are trying to assess is the plausibility of a particular theory of interaction. So, as I was saying, the evidence that we have is very clear that there is interaction between body and mind. Even if you think that the mind is physical, you can think that it's a sort of a complex series of phenomena that itself is given rise to by the brain, right? So there's an interaction between like lower level brain processes and the higher level processes that we call mind, right? So that clearly happens, but the question is, if the mind is ontologically separate from the body, if it's some sort of different substance, how can that interaction happen? And it's not enough just to say, well, it just does. We know that it does because, okay, well, you say that it does, but how plausible is that? When you're assessing the plausibility of a philosophical theory, you've got to look at the different assumptions that the theory needs to make. And if it just sort of assumes that this interaction somehow happens without being able to say how, then that significantly diminishes the plausibility of the theory. And this is the point that Armstrong's making here. Look, if you can't say anything about how it's supposed to happen, then your theory is that much worse. And this response here is pretty much just the same response that Descartes gave like 400 years ago. It's just saying, look, dualists are dualists because they think that dualism is the best theory for explaining certain types of philosophical puzzles, right? So, or they're led there by certain arguments that we looked at in the previous video, mostly thought experiments or intuitions. Now, they don't pretend to have a theory of how the interaction is supposed to occur, but the claim is, look, this substance dualism is not supposed to be a neuroscientific theory. It's not defended as a neuroscientific theory, so it should not be evaluated principally on how good a neuroscientific theory is. I think that's a complete joke of a response, right? We're not actually saying that it should be a neuroscientific theory. What the claim is that substance dualism needs to explain how it interfaces with neuroscience. It's not supposed to replace neuroscience, but it has to explain how it even remotely, like even roughly, connects to neuroscience. Because interaction as substance dualism says that there's some immaterial substance that has causal effects on the brain, or causal effects on the mind and the brain as part of the body, right? That theory in that form is making a neuroscientific claim, and it therefore has to be plausible and consistent with what we know from neuroscience, and not just neuroscience, but like cognitive psychology as well, and just medicine and all sorts of other spheres of science. So you can't make a claim that has empirical and scientific content, and then when someone challenges you to demonstrate that or even explain how that could be possible, then retreat and say, oh, I'm not making a scientific theory. That's just to abdicate your responsibility. If your theory has implications on other well-known areas of knowledge or comparatively well-known areas of knowledge, you have to say something about how it's supposed to fit with those theories. So I think this is a completely inadequate response. It's just as far as I'm concerned, special pleading. It's just saying, I don't have to give this theory because I don't want to. There's no actual substance here at all. Oh, yeah, and this is what I said before. So David also says, look, you can know that something is the case without knowing how it is the case. You can know that an immaterial soul interacts with the body/brain without knowing how it interacts with the brain. And that's absolutely true, right? But this completely misses the point, which is the point is not that it's impossible to know that without knowing how. The point is that if a theory says that, but can't say anything about how, that reduces the plausibility of the theory. I think the best response from the interactionist substance dualist here is just to admit that their theory is radically implausible because of the inability to answer this question about how interaction is supposed to occur, and simply saying, yeah, I agree, we lose plausibility points on these grounds, but there's so much greater evidence, like the strength of the arguments for it outweighs this problem. I think that's the best response, because I don't think that there's any response to this, and the idea that somehow, we just don't have to answer it because we don't feel like it. It's not a neuroscientific theory. You can know that without knowing how. This is just all obfuscation. The fact is that the theory doesn't have anything to say about this major and important issue, and that reduces the plausibility of the theory. if you don't know how and have no idea how, even in principle, then that should lead us to be skeptical about whether it is in fact the case. That we apply that sort of reasoning everywhere. You need to balance out the evidence for that with the evidence against, in terms of if how is not plausible, right? So these things are weighed up against each other. The substance dualists here are just trying to not get us to look at the man behind the curtain, because they actually know that they have nothing to say about this. So they're just trying to special plead their way out of having to admit that this reduces the plausibility of their hypothesis. Now, all that being said, there are substance dualists who try to say more specific things. Excuse me, I've got something in my throat here. If only my throat was immaterial, I could probably talk for longer without getting hoarse, eh? You could raise that one with God. Why did he give us these material bodies that have all these imperfections? It seems like it's a pretty inferior design. Okay. So this argument here is making a different type of response here. This is saying, look, it's true that we don't really know how to explain interaction between an immaterial mind and a physical substance like a brain or something, right? So we saw this as a similar strategy before with the idea that it's the unintelligibility problem, right? It's to say, look, this is a problem for physicalists as well, although we saw that it's actually not nearly as much of a problem for physicalists. So this is a similar type of response. It's a tu quo que response. It's saying like, it's basically, oh yeah, you have the problem as well, right? So I'm just going to avoid the criticism. So here what they're saying is there anything less mysterious about physical interaction compared to mental physical interaction? And again, one would be, well, we have spatial location, right? So at least you can say two physical entities or particles or substances or whatever interact causally with each other when they're in the same or close enough physical proximity. And that doesn't seem available to the case of minds and physical substances, of course, because traditionally understood, immaterial minds don't have a physical location. This will relate to the pairing problem again a little bit later. But anyway, the point that's relevant here is that what's being said here, why should spatial contact have causal repercussions? The fact that spatial objects coming into contact routinely generates causal exchange is obvious enough. So we know that spatial contact, or at least proximity, is important for physical interactions. But why is that the case? Is it because of the object's mass or volume? If so, why do mass or volume have the causal liabilities and powers they do? So I'm just going to see, yeah, okay. Eventually, all the disputants will have to come to a point of claiming that things have certain powers without being able to offer a deeper account of why they have those powers, or the basis of that sort of interaction. So none of these options seems demonstrably better than the dualist positing person-body interaction. Okay, so that's the last part of the interaction problem here. Now, let's think about this response. This is exactly the same tu quo que response that we saw previously, as I just noted. It's to say, look, this is a problem, but it's a problem for physicalists as well, so we don't have to worry about it. Tu quo que responses like this are nearly always bad because, first of all, it doesn't actually respond to the objection. It's more like just changing the subject and saying, well, yeah, but you have this problem as well. That's not actually an argument for your view. It's just an argument, at most, it's an argument against a competing view. So maybe physicalism has this problem too, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem for dualism, right? So it's not really a good response, even on the face of it. But the second point is the fact that two views could potentially both have a problem does not entail that they both have the problem to the same degree or to the same extent. And this is what we saw previously with the notion of specifying the identity conditions of physical objects over time. Yeah, there's an issue there, but there are many more principles and options available to the physicalist because they're not constrained in the same way that the dualist is, with the idea that, say, an immaterial mind doesn't have a physical location, it doesn't have any internal properties, like it's ultimately simple and all this other stuff, right? So there's much less they can appeal to there to actually answer the question. The physicalist has many other options. Likewise here, it's true that we can debate about exactly why it is that objects of massive objects exert a gravitational effect on each other, for example. Like, why does that happen? Or even general relativity doesn't really tell us why. It just sort of provides a theoretical framework for predicting the form and magnitude of the effects, but it just sort of postulates that that's how it is. Likewise for the other fundamental forces, right? Electromagnetism and so forth. So, why is it that electrons have the charge that they do and exert a certain magnitude of attraction on positive charges and repulsion for negative charges? So, you can get really fundamental and ask, why do these things exist? And that's all well and good. And it's true that we don't have an explanation for these things, but let's look at the difference here, right? What we're being told is our inability to explain exactly why the fundamental forces work the way they do is somehow equivalent to the inability of the substance dualist to say literally anything about how an immaterial mind interacts with a physical body. So on the one hand, we have like all of physics, all of chemistry, all of biology, all of neuroscience, cognitive psychology that explains the causal processes that go into explicating how physical elements, fields, and so forth interact with each other, and to produce cells and produce organs and minds and so forth, and brains and so forth, to ultimately lead to a physical mind, right? We don't have all the details filled in, but we have an awful lot that we can say about it. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is nothing. Like you heard it. I was saying all of the theory that there is. There's nothing. There's no theory at all, right? So what we're told is an incomplete theory is just as good as a complete absence of any theory. Now, that's total nonsense, right? This is just the same thing as when the young Earth creationists say, oh, look, you can't explain exactly how the Cambrian explosion happened. You can't explain exactly how life emerged. You can't explain exactly how these two different one species gave rise to another, because there's like missing fossils. And you can't explain this particular anomaly with the genetic evidence and so forth. Like on and on, there's always little gaps and pieces and missing aspects that you can't explain. And therefore, our complete absence of a theory, God did it, is just as good, right? Like this is what pseudoscientists and denialists and, in my opinion, poor philosophers do all the time. It's contrasts an incomplete theory with, and therefore, and highlighting its incompleteness or gaps, or theoretical issues that aren't fully resolved, and then pretends or purports that that's just as good as their theory, which actually has no content at all, that doesn't explain anything. So I completely reject this equivalency. I think that this is utterly ludicrous as a response. The physicalist has days and days of like lecture content worth of things to say about how physical interaction occurs, from a very practical experimental level right through to an applied level and a theoretical level. There's all sorts of things to say there. The substance dualist has zip bupkis, nada, yet nothing. They can't say anything about this. Some try. There have been people who've given some very implausible explanations. David doesn't really try to defend those here, so I won't get into it. But what it all comes down to is that they actually have nothing. Remember that if you're going to say that an immaterial mind interacts with the brain, then you have to explain how that immaterial mind alters the voltage potential across the membrane of neurons, altering the propensity or frequency of action potential firings in those neurons, thereby affecting the processing of information and the cascading of activity across neural networks in the brain. We don't know that the physicalists can't prove that patterns of activity in neural networks are sufficient for all thought and consciousness, but we certainly know that they are necessary for it and closely involved in it. And so it's not plausible to say that an immaterial mind could somehow affect our thoughts without affecting these neural networks. And substance dualists don't seem to claim this. They just sort of wave their hands and say that they don't somehow need to be able to give an account for how immaterial substances can affect thoughts without affecting the concentration of ions across the membrane potential. That's what it comes down to. If you don't have a theory that can at least in principle give a general account, I'm not saying it has to precisely explain everything, because no theory can, but if you don't have anything to say about how an immaterial soul can change, like at a precise level, ion concentrations across neural membranes, then you don't have a theory. Like, as far as I'm concerned, there's just no substance to there. It's just an utter pretense that there's anything useful to say about this. So that's what I have to say about the interaction problem. Now let's move on to the pairing problem. This is closely related to the previous two issues, but it's a bit of a different take on it. So let's have a think about this. The first question we talked about was the idea that a soul is unintelligible, like we can't explicate what it's supposed to be or how it's supposed to work. And one aspect of that was, what are the conditions that specify or that individuates souls? So what makes your soul different to my soul? Because they're both supposed to be simple, right? And they don't have a location. So how do we, what makes them different? It seems like there's nothing to make them distinct from each other. The physicalist has all sorts of options that it seems like the dualist doesn't. Now, this is a related but slightly different question. It's not what makes souls different from each other. It's not how does a soul interact with the body. It's why does a soul interact with this body but not that other body? So it's a pairing problem. How does one soul pair to one body and not another? So you can see that it's connected to these issues, but it is a bit different. Souls could be individuated from each other, but that doesn't automatically mean they're going to be associated with one and only one body, right? So this is a further issue that the substance dualist, again, needs to have some account of. I don't think they need to have a full and complete account that resolves all issues, but they need to have something to offer, in my opinion, right? Any good theory needs to have something to tell us. It needs to have some explanatory power and some plausibility in light of other things that we know. And so once again, we get this, what I regard as a cop-out. We can know that something is the case without knowing how it is the case. Imagine if scientists just always said this, right? Of course, it's true that you can know that something is the case without knowing how it is the case. But scientists don't use this as an excuse to stop trying to answer questions. Substance dualists have made zero progress in answering these questions in 400 years. As far as I'm concerned, they're making the same arguments. The arguments have become a little bit more sophisticated in their logical form, but other than that, it's exactly the same issues. I don't think they have anything whatever of substance to offer in answer to these questions. And so what do? They just say, well, we can know even without knowing how. We can know that without knowing how. And seemingly that's enough for them. I just think that that's a joke of that. Like, I find that so unsatisfactory. But anyway, now let's look at this other response that David gives. Does he have a quote for this one? Yes. Okay. So this, I think, is a really interesting response here. That's mentioned in this book here. So by, again, Brandon Rickabar and Moreland. So virtually all contemporary substance dualists believe that the soul is spatially located, even though it is not extended. So it has a spatial location, but it's not extended in space. Some provide arguments for the soul being located in one specific place in the body. Others believe that the soul is to the body as God is to space, namely fully present at each location in the body. Either way, the spatial location requirement is satisfied. So the idea about the soul being located at every place in the body is interesting, but let's put that aside for the moment and just focus on this first part here. I don't know if this is true that virtually all substance dualists believe this, because traditionally this is not what substance dualists believe. The idea is that an immaterial substance does not have a physical location. And this is why I was sort of hedging that a little bit in what I said previously, that it doesn't have a location. Traditionally, that was the view, right? But David here seems to be defending the view that, in fact, an immaterial soul does have a physical location. And that physical location is located somewhere in the body, or perhaps it's located at every point in the body. I'm not going to get too hung up on that exact point, because I have bigger objections than that, right? So now this, if true, this, I think, would resolve the pairing problem, because you can say, well, look, the explanation for how one soul pairs to one body is that it's co-located with the body, right? Okay, that kind of makes sense, right? But let's think about how that's supposed to work, right? Yeah, so this is a slightly separate response here. So let's consider this response. Immaterial souls are supposed to be co-located with your body, according to this view, right? Let's ask the question, how does your body come to have the location that it does? Well, let's think about me. So I'm on planet Earth, right? I'm pulled down towards the center of the Earth by gravity, but I'm kept from going through the floor by the normal force, which pushes back against me. And the reason for that is because of, ultimately, it's electromagnetic repulsion, or the electrostatic repulsion between the electron clouds in, well, my bottom on the seat and the matter that makes up the seat, and then the seat is on the floor and so forth, right? So these are the forces that keep solid objects and liquid objects from passing through each other. It's ultimately repulsion between the electron clouds in the different materials. So to put it crudely, the reason why my body is located where it is and stays where it is because of the interaction of the force of electromagnetism and the force of gravity. I mean, the strong and weak force have their roles to play as well. It gets complicated if we go into all of that, but it's mainly electromagnetism and gravity. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that seems to imply that the soul, if it stays where I'm located, it must have some way of interacting with electromagnetism and gravity, right? Like otherwise, how does it stay on Earth, right? Or maybe you can say, well, maybe the soul is not pulled to Earth by gravity, but maybe there's some force that keeps it like locked onto my body. What force that would be, one can only speculate, but it must be some other type of force. But the thing is that it seems like that's going to have to be a force that affects matter as well, because you're going to say that the immaterial soul interacts with my body. My body is a physical object, so it only interacts with physical, like it experiences physical forces. So it seems like that if you're going to say that the immaterial soul actually exists in space, like it has a location, it has to have a way of like detecting or receiving or being causally affected by the location of my body through some physical effect of my body. And this is just kind of crazy, right? Like we're saying that there's this sort of mysterious force that not just has an interaction between my brain and my mind. I mean, that's difficult enough to explain, but actually it's actually the physical interaction between the location or some forces or properties of my body that relate to the location and the soul as well. So this soul, it can interact with it can interact with the ion concentrations across my membranes, across the cell membranes in my brain. And it can also somehow interact with my body in a way that maintains its location with my body, perhaps gravity or electromagnetism or some other force, and therefore exists in space. It's beginning to sound like it's a physical thing, right? Like it kind of has a bunch of physical properties. I would actually extend that and say that the nature of the mind is to process information, and processing information requires distinct internal states, which means that the mind cannot be fully simple. But I'm going to save that for another video because that's a more extended argument that goes beyond what David has said here. But the point I would make is that the more physical properties or powers the substance dualists want to layer onto the soul, the less plausible it is that this is actually anything immaterial. And I think it's just nonsense, the idea that a soul can somehow stay located exactly where your body is. What this is doing is resolving one problem. It resolves the pairing problem by creating a whole other huge problem. Like, how is it that the soul can now interact with my body's location? Not just like physical states of the brain, but like it stays co-located with my body. How the heck is that supposed to be happening? Especially if you think that it's fully present at each location in the body, because that's kind of nuts. Because where is the boundaries of the body? Like when I shed a skin cell, does that affect where the soul is? And if you think it's one specific place in the body, well, where? Is that the pineal gland? Like we're going back to that? This is why I say that substance dualism has made no advances in 400 years, because it's the exact same stupid arguments that make no sense at all. Anyway, so I don't have a lot of respect for that response. I think it's trying to solve one problem by creating an even bigger one. Here's an interesting comment here. Thinking of a soul as a little ghost possessing a meat mecha makes the most sense to me. It works if you don't think too hard about it, how the brain works. It can be a heat radiator, I guess. Yeah, I honestly think that that's kind of how a lot of people think about this intuitively. And you actually see this depiction in a lot of Hollywood movies, even sci-fi ones, where there's like some sort of glowing cloud of energy that is the soul, and it like physically moves between one body and another, or one place and another place, and then innervates that body somehow. So it's like some sort of little ghost, but which is also physical because you can see it and it moves from location to one location to another. But then it has a power to innervate a body, which otherwise is either inert or doesn't. It either acts in a different way or doesn't act at all, depending on which movie you're talking about or which theory you want to go with. I think that this is something like what people think, and maybe how the substance dualists think about this. I don't know. And yeah, it sort of makes sense as long as you don't think about it for more than about 30 seconds. In fact, Braxton talked about this in a video I reviewed, I don't know, a year or two ago, when he talked about the idea that the soul is like the driver and your body is like the car. And then he actually extended that analogy to like sometimes the car's on autopilot, but then, and he was talking about it in the context of demon possession. I don't know if anyone remembers this video. It was fascinating because he said like a demon can come in and like pull your soul out of the driver's seat and then sit itself in the driver's seat and like take over your body. Of course, this all raises the analogy kind of breaks down because a person in a car is a physical object in another physical object. If your soul is analogous to the person driving the car, then then it seems like the soul is a physical object somewhere inside your body, and that's effectively what's being stated here. Of course, they can't say that the soul is a physical object, but they're talking about it as if it is a physical object. It exists somewhere specific inside your body and has very specific causal effects on it, and somehow maintains its co-location with your body. Sounds physical to me. Like, what are you even talking about by saying that it's not physical? So, yeah, I agree that there's a lot of, I think, well, there's not a lot of careful thought put through as to how this is supposed to work that I've seen. Let me put it that way. The soul is also where my hair is. I don't know. Like, if you grow a beard, does your soul extend? Like, it just gets dumber and dumber the more you think about it. Like, and the notion that it can't be extended in space is interesting as well, because that would seem to mean that if the soul is located at a specific point in your body, that it's like an exact, precise location. And you could ask, well, why there? Like, how does that happen? Like, why is it located at exactly that point? What causal processes means that it ends up there? And I don't think this is actually discussed in this video, but you can also ask a question about where do souls come from and how do they come to occupy that place in your body? Like, do soul parts exist in the ova and sperm and come together? Like, I know that there's actually one view that says that they're sort of created through that physical process, and there's others that say no, God like zaps it into the zygote at the moment of fertilization. But like, you know, the more that you specify about this, the more ridiculous it gets, and the more additional questions that it raises. So I think a lot of defenders just try and run to the hills and avoid actually having to answer these questions. Anyway, so coming back, there's another response to the pairing problem here. So Kim we've seen him before, he's a physicalist who raises this critique. So the substance dualist must provide an answer to the question of why souls enter into certain types of causal relations with some bodies and not others. And Kim doesn't think that the dualist has a good answer to this, and neither do I. Now, what do you think the response is going to be? So the first response to the pairing problem was, well, actually, physical bodies and souls are co-located. So that explains how one soul interacts with one body. We saw that has a whole host of problems. So I think the more common response is, you remember our old friend, tu quo que, right? Oh, yeah. So those who, well, let me read it here. So too, I claim those who believe we are composite objects, so composite physical objects, will be hard-pressed to put forward satisfying answers to questions like, why is this composite person composed of these parts rather than some other parts? Why do these parts compose this composite person rather than some other composite person? And so on. So it's exactly the same response. Like, it's, third time in a row now, the responses just say, oh yeah, but physicalists don't have a response to this either, or they also have to answer this problem. And I think this is just wrong, right? Again, like, it's true that physicalists don't have a full and complete comprehensive answer to all questions, and nor do they have a full resolution to every metaphysical issue. I agree, right? That is not a reasonable standard to hold a theory to. But just because one theory is complete doesn't mean that an even less complete theory is on par with it. So these questions here, why is this composite person composed of these parts rather than some other parts? That's not actually the same question. So that's the physicalist was asking. That's not the question of the pairing problem, at least not as I interpret it. I mean, I guess you can interpret it differently. But if you ask, look, why am I, James Fodor, composed of these particular parts? Let's say by parts it means atoms, rather than some other parts. In order to answer that question, all I have to do is give a causal history of how these atoms came to occupy my body, right? And we can't do that in terms of like literally individual atoms. But in principle, we have those answers, right? Like, you could trace back through my development and all the food that I've eaten and the air that I've breathed and the water that I've drunk, and you could trace back the causal history of that. Like, we kind of understand these things and how they work. So we can't actually construct that, because it's, how would you collect all those facts? But the point is that we understand how that can be the case.
We understand how it can be the case that any particular clumps of matter can come to make a particular person at a given time. It's just all the normal processes of physics and chemistry and biology, right? There's no real mysteries there, not fundamental like metaphysical problems at least. But you can't appeal to that for the pairing problem. Like, what are the processes that can explain why one soul pairs with one body? It's not the normal processes of physics and chemistry and biology and development and so forth, right? Like, none of those are relevant. So what are the principles? Again, this is just, I don't understand how philosophers can actually think this is a good response. On the one hand, we have a huge wealth of theory that can provide at least the general picture of how it is that any given body can be made of certain matter. Right. And on the other hand, we have literally nothing. And they're trying to say that the two are equivalent because neither is complete. It's ridiculous, right? Like, there's just no comparison here. It's the same strategy. It's to present a false equivalence of an imperfect theory on the one hand and a totally useless and empty theory on the other. And as before, I don't think this response works. So I think the pairing problem stands as a strong objection to dualism, unless you adopt this idea that the immaterial mind is physically co-located with the body, which can resolve the pairing problem, but then raises a whole host of other issues. It basically makes the interaction problem even more intense because somehow somehow the soul has to interact physically with the body in a whole bunch of extra ways. It has to maintain its physical location, right? So if that's the route you go down, you just make another problem worse rather than you solve one problem at the cost of making another worse. So don't know that you've really made any progress there. And yeah, this is the response. This is fundamentally why I'm a physicalist, is because all of the non-physicalist viewpoints, not just about philosophy of mind, but anything else, amount to just saying, well, it just does. It just works that way. Whereas only physicalists, it seems to me, even try to give descriptive mechanistic accounts of how things work. And across the board, I think that they just blow all competitors out of the water in terms of their explanatory scope and power and plausibility in the light of our of knowledge we have. But anyway, that's a bit of a broader question. Now, this is another issue that David doesn't talk about. At least I don't think he mentions this in the video. Maybe there's an offhand remark that I forgot, but he doesn't discuss it at length, which is the idea of possession, because also many at least religious dualists, not all substance dualists are religious, but many who are, believe in the possibility of demonic possession. So that is multiple bodies being filled with or possessed by multiple spirits, such as demons. Braxton has talked about this, for example. And yeah, I mean, I would say physicalism can't explain that, but of course, physicalism rejects the notion that demons exist. So, but if you are a substance dualist, that raises a whole host of questions like, how is it that the souls can move between bodies and what that even amounts to and what's happening there? But anyway, David hasn't defended that, so I'm not going to go into that detail here. Oh, this is also a good question. So do dualists believe that animals have simpler souls? They can, and I think David does. I'll let him speak to that when we have our discussion. But a common strategy to say that, yeah, any being that has a mind will also have an associated soul, but there's different types of soul depending on the type of organism that it is, which I think has some plausibility to it. But then it raises questions like, where do all these different souls come from? And how is it that the souls somehow match up with the body that they pair with? And again, you start asking difficult questions which have no in principle answers, because unlike physical science, there's no way to address these questions. Anyway, so we've looked at three objections to substance dualism: the unintelligibility objection, the interaction problem, and the pairing problem. Now we're looking at causal closure. This is closely related to the interaction problem, but it's a different take on it. The interaction problem asks, how is the immaterial soul able to interact with the physical mind, what the principles or processes there are. The causal closure argument isn't asking how, it's actually saying that's impossible. Like, we know that this can't happen, or at least with a very high probability that no such interaction can occur. And this arises because of the idea of the causal closure of the physical. So this is the causal closure of the physical is, I would say, a fundamental assumption of pretty much all scientific practice, at least a working assumption. And then if you're a philosophical naturalist or a physicalist like me, you'll take that to the level of a metaphysical assumption as well, that all causes in the physical world, let me say that differently, all effects in the physical world only have physical causes. So there's nothing outside of the physical world that has causal effects on the physical. Note that this isn't the same as determinism. It's not saying that everything physical has a physical cause. It's just saying that anything that is caused is physically caused. There's no non-physical causes, like from outside, whatever that might mean, right? So obviously, if you believe in the causal closure of the physical, You don't believe, you're not going to believe in the ability of an immaterial soul to interact with the physical body, because that would be causes from outside the physical, right? So that would be ruled out. Whether the existence, parenthetically, whether you have to be an atheist if you believe in causal closure of the physical is interesting, because there might be a way out here if you say that God created the universe in a way that doesn't involve a causal interaction with it, in which case he just sort of poofs the universe into existence and then doesn't do anything. And the universe continues on working under its own physical processes. In that way, I think you could have, and that's sort of a form of deism, right? Like God makes it happen, but then he doesn't touch it after that. And I think that probably would preserve causal closure. But maybe we could debate the finer points of that. But anyway, I'm just trying to explicate what the idea is. Now, pretty much all scientific theorizing assumes the causal closure of the physical, because scientists never say when there's an unexpected result, or well, maybe a demon did it, or maybe there's an unexplained magical force, or it was the Tao that somehow shaped the destiny of the molecules or whatever. Like they don't reason like that. The closest it'll come is when we measure the energy content of the universe and we're like, this doesn't match up to what we can see. There must be some unidentified stuff there. We're going to call it dark matter. So scientists will postulate unknown physical causes or unknown physical substances or matter, but they won't postulate immaterial or non-material forces. The reason, one of the reasons for this is a methodological approach, which is that when you say something has an immaterial or non-physical cause, well, what constrains its behavior? Like there's no theory of that. So there's simply nothing more to be said in general. And a second reason is because I would argue we have very strong reasons to accept the causal closure of the physical. But we might talk a bit more about that in a moment. So this is an explication of why causal closure is relevant here. So the causal closure of the physical world means that physical events can only be causally influenced by other physical events, as I said here, and through mechanisms of nothing but other physical processes. So if there is soul stuff could exist, but it couldn't interact with the physical world causally, because that would violate the causal closure. There'd be some sort of physical properties that would be affected by something outside of it. Okay, and so what's the response to this? Well, here's one response. Why is the principle of causal closure itself supposed to be so obviously correct? Clearly, this principle is not and could not be an empirical result. No empirical investigation that is at all feasible could ever establish that human body is the most likely locus of such an external influence are, in fact, never affected even in small and subtle ways by non-material causes. Let me finish the quote here. So we're told that scientists accept this principle, and often most philosophers accept it as well. But do they have any compelling reason for such acceptance, or is this vaunted principle nothing more than an unargued and undefended assumption, a kind of intellectual prejudice in the literal meaning of the word? I don't know what other meaning of the word there would be. And so he goes on here. So taken in the abstract, apart from any appeal to a specific account of conscious mental phenomena, I have no idea whether the principle of causal closure is true or not. And I cannot imagine how to rationally decide whether it is true without first arriving at a defensible account of conscious mental states. It seems obvious that the mental states do causally affect the material realm. And he says, if a material account of consciousness is correct, then the principle of causal closure seems likely to be true. But if no such account is correct, then the principle is false. So to argue for the truth of materialism or a presumption in favor of materialism by appeal to causal closure is putting the cart before the horse. Okay, so let's talk about this. So what he's basically saying here is that we can't know whether the causal closure is true until we've resolved the problems with philosophy of mind or mental physical causation relationships. And it seems that the reason for that is because, look, if the mind, according to him, clearly does interact with the physical world. So if the mind is non-physical, then causal closure will be false, right? Now, we might agree in some sort of strict sense that insofar as there are any open philosophical or scientific questions, we can't be sure that causal closure is true, because maybe there's some sort of unknown non-physical causal process that resolves this problem, right? But again, we come back to the issue that we've faced a number of times. It's an issue of plausibility. So if we have, as I think that there is, overwhelming evidence from physical science that the causal closure is correct, then that gives us a strong presumption in favor that causal closure will hold in other cases as well. Now, here he says, clearly this principle could not be an empirical result, because there's no way to establish that there's non-physical causes that affect human bodies, even in subtle ways. I think that this is an example of something that only a philosopher would say, right? It's technically true, but for all practical purposes, just wrong, right? So what do I mean by that? Obviously, it's possible that there could be some sort of subtle and complicated effects of immaterial substances on human bodies, which have not been detected in any controlled conditions, right? Because it might be difficult to do that. Possible, yes. How plausible? Well, not very plausible. Why is that? Because it's not like human bodies are some strange alien entity that we've only just found. We know a lot about human bodies. We know they're made up of organs, which in turn are made up of different types of tissues, which in turn are made up of different types of cells, which in turn are made up of proteins and nucleic acids and lipids and carbohydrates. And these are all organic molecules, which we know the structure of. We know a lot of their physical and chemical properties. We know how they interact with each other, how they're formed. We know how enzymes affect them and genetic codes and all this other blah, 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 all this other stuff. And we know the underlying physical properties of that give rise to the chemistry of these molecules. And we know about the different elements that make them up. And we know how their properties derive ultimately from the number of electrons that are in the different energy shells surrounding atoms or in molecular orbitals as well. And we can link those directly, these physical properties directly to theories of fundamental physics, right? So we have a whole chain of scientific explanation, not complete, but very substantial, which links our understanding of fundamental physics all the way up to understanding of brain phenomena. I'm not saying this is comprehensive, but it's very detailed, and we know a lot of information about how different parts of that work. All throughout that process, there's no room for immaterial causal effects. Like, we don't have any theories that would account for that. There's no obvious hole that needs that to fill. We have all of the principles we need to account for the behavior of the brain, working upwards from physical properties, ultimately, of like subatomic particles and right through the sciences, right? That edifice of theoretical and empirical results from science, as well as some theoretical, theorizing from philosophy as well, to sort of fill in the sort of theoretical parts of it, which is partly what I'm writing about in my book. But anyway, that theoretical and empirical edifice is why we think that causal closure is true, right? There's no room. We know a lot about bodies, and there's no room for these non-material causes. As far as we can tell, is there hypothetically a possibility that they could happen, that they could exist? Yes, but our theory doesn't say anything about that, and our theory doesn't require that, and it would be very hard to understand how it would fit into any of our theories. It's the way I raised the question before. How is it that an immaterial soul can change the ion concentration across the cellular membrane of a neuron to change its action potential, the firing rate of its action potential, so that might have an effect on activity of neural networks, to have an effect on mental processes? Unless you can have some way to answer that, I'm going to say that they can't do that, because there's no way that they can do that, because no one has a theory of how an immaterial mind can change ion concentrations in a specific targeted way, I mean, in general, let alone in a specific targeted way. And it's just kind of silly to think that that's possible. There's no space for it in our scientific theories. That's why we have overwhelming reason to think that causal closure is true. Not absolute definitive certainty, but very strong, compelling reasons. I think this guy probably knows nothing about most of this. Robert Kuhn's, well, this is an edited volume, so I'm not actually sure who wrote this one, but they probably learn little or nothing about these theories, and are just willing to reject them by, well, I don't know if it's true or not. Maybe there could be subtle influences that no one's been able to detect, without being able to say anything about why that's plausible. Again, there's a retreat to possibility without any attempt to deal with plausibility, given everything we know from physical and biological science. So what they want us to do, what he's saying, oh, sorry, it says Lawrence Bonjour, right? And the edited volume is by Kuhn's. My apologies, so I do know who said this. I didn't have that on the first part of the quote. But what's being said here is that we should ignore all of this background knowledge about how bodies work and just pretend we don't know anything about that, and then think about whether the causal closure holds. And then he says, well, I have no idea. Because the reason he says he has no idea is because he's ignoring all the evidence that we do have that the causal closure does hold. And he's only looking at this one issue about the philosophy of mind and the interaction of mind and body. And he's saying, look, until we answer that, we're not going to know. But of course, that's ridiculous. Why would we ignore all the evidence that we do have about how physical bodies work and the fact that there's not any plausible room there for immaterial causal effects? So this response is just totally missing the point. The point is we have very strong reasons for thinking that causal closure holds, at the very least for physical, like human bodies, and probably everywhere, but at the very least in that context. And it's not definitive, but it's very strong. And you have to then explain how you overcome that prime implausibility. And at least Bonjour here is saying, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to ignore all the evidence and pretend that there isn't any evidence apart from the specific issue in question. I just think that's a completely inadequate response. Okay, so pausing there, there's a few things from chat that I wanted to mention here. So one point here, which is a little off topic, but I'll say something about it quickly. So where do physical laws live in the physicalist view? Well, different physicalists have different things to say about this. So if you're Humean about physical laws, you don't think that physical laws really live anywhere. They're just essentially descriptions of how stuff behaves. So they don't really exist independently in any real way. They're just sort of generalizations. So I'm not a Humean about laws. I do think that there's more to them than just sort of descriptive generalizations or correlations, you might say. But I don't think that physical laws like exist in some sort of Platonic realm or something. You can say like, oh, look, here's the physical law. I think physical laws describe, the way I would say it is that physical laws describe the causal powers of fundamental physical substances. And by fundamental physical substances, I mean something like quantum fields. So quantum fields exist in space-time, and they have certain characteristics or properties that define how they interact with each other and themselves. And we call these physical, we call our descriptions of those physical properties and powers, we call them physical laws. But I think that the use of law is probably not very good, because it sounds like it's the same word as used to describe legislative laws that are passed by a body of humans that make a decision. Not all human laws are like that. Some emerge through unconscious sort of social processes, like grammatical laws, for example, or spelling laws. But anyway, getting a bit off topic there. But the point is, I think we should probably not talk about physical laws. We should probably just talk about physical processes and the physical properties that the different physical objects or substances have. But anyway, that's my short answer to that, and I'll have more to say about that in my book when I get around to finishing that. So Digital Gnosis, or Nathan, is linking to a video here, which I won't open now just because I want to finish this presentation, but where there's some discussion about conservation laws. And so Nathan asks here, presumably relating to that discussion, what do you think of the idea that strong emergence undermines causal closure? This is an interesting point, actually. So there's a notion of emergence, which is defining emergence off the cuff is not an easy thing to do. Emergence is an idea that some kind of phenomenon, let's see if we're talking about a physical phenomenon, some physical phenomenon can exist because of some sort of lower level, more basic, more fundamental physical phenomenon, but not be reducible to it. So maybe you think life is an example of this, or maybe you think mental phenomena an example of this, right? That they exist in virtue of underlying physical and chemical reactions, but they're not reducible to those things. Many, in fact, I think it's the majority view of philosophers think that higher order physical properties and phenomena are not reducible to all of the lower order ones, that there's a need for a hierarchy of scientific explanations at different levels of abstraction, like physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and so forth, right? The so-called special sciences, right? Sciences above basic physics. There's two different forms of emergence. One is weak and one is strong. I am not going to try to explain the difference between them because it's very complicated and not widely agreed on how to demarcate them. But what I will say is I don't think strong emergence is a really coherent concept, and I don't think it allows us to get around causal closure. Some people think that you can define some type of higher order causal processes that emerge from lower order ones, but are not reducible to them. And that somehow bypasses a physical causal closure principle. But I think that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So Kim Jagwan has written a lot about this in the context of philosophy of mind. He's been referenced in different parts of this video. And so I think he has some good points to make about this. He objects to the notion of emergence and thinks it's not explanatory. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And I tend to agree with that. But this would require a more detailed discussion to work through these issues. But my short answer is I think strong emergence is not a plausible or a very good response. I think it's in large part a confused idea, to be honest. Weak emergence, I don't necessarily have a problem with, but strong emergence, I think it's a bit of nonsense. And strong emergence isn't the same as substance dualism anyway. I don't think you could. So strong emergentism would generally be associated with either panpsychism or maybe some forms of property dualism. But the idea about substance dualism is that it is a very distinct substance that does not emerge in any sense from physical substance. So maybe you could have some sort of hybrid view about that, but at least traditionally, like Cartesian substance dualism is not an emergentist view. Anyway, hopefully that sort of helps a little bit. Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be helpful to get into that level at this point, Nathan. That's not what I prepared for here. So let's leave that for another time. Let me come back to this idea of causal closure. Where was I? Oh, yes. Okay. So this is David talking to us here, or writing this. So how can the study of physical causes and effects ever rule out the presence of non-physical causes? And this is the point that was being made in this by Bonjour here. And I think, is it the same point being made here? Yeah, so this is essentially saying, look, scientists don't look for non-physical causes. They look for physical causes. That's methodological naturalism, right? After all, they're not investigating such causes or whether they exist, only if one presupposes physicalism, and thus that the physical sciences give an exhaustive account of the world. It doesn't make sense to conclude that there are no non-physical causes because physical scientists have not identified them through empirical investigations. Again, I think this is a little unfair, but I'm going to say it anyway. This, in my view, is the sort of thing that only a philosopher could say. Again, it's sort of theoretic. It's technically true, but in every other relevant sense, not true, in my opinion. So the claim that scientists only look for physical causes, they don't look for non-physical causes. I don't really think this is true, but it's true in some sense, right? A scientist is not going to appeal to a non-physical cause or hypothesize that a soul or God or magic or the Tao or whatever did something, right? Occasionally you might find kooky ones saying that, but in general, they don't sort of make that sort of appeal. That's considered non-scientific and is not taken seriously. But that's not really because they're not looking for non-physical causes, because scientists are very happy to study anything that they can study, right? So the problem is, in a sense, with the label. Like anything that can be investigated with the scientific method will be investigated and theorized and studied. It's not like scientists are going to rule out investigating a certain class of phenomenon because it's called like non-physical. It's just that the standard set of things that are typically called non-physical, like immaterial souls or magic or spirits or gods or whatever else, there's just no theory about them. There's nothing you can say scientifically about them, and they therefore can't be used in an explanatory way. They don't make any connection or predictable regular predictions that you can test experimentally, and they don't feature into mechanistic explanations. Basically, they don't serve the function that is necessary to construct a scientific explanation. In my view, this is why they're bad explanations. But the point I'm trying to make here is that scientists would be more than happy to appeal to something that's sort of quote unquote non-physical, if only they could incorporate it into an explanation that can be tested and fit into other scientific ideas. This is why, like the ectoplasm theory of an immaterial substance doesn't really work very well, because if that's what an immaterial substance was, it was some exotic form of matter, then it seems like it would just be part of, maybe a weird part, but still part of the physical universe and something that we could study scientifically. So I kind of don't really agree with this point. Like, it's not like scientists are just not investigating this because it's not their job description. They're not investigating this because there's nothing to investigate. There's nothing to say. There's no theory. There's no predictions. There's just nothing. It's just hot air. And so they don't do that, right? Like, well, how can you do it? It's impossible. And that in turn leads to the crucial point, which is that these theories have no content. They don't say anything. It's just that the theory amounts to declaring the explanandum, right? A theory is supposed to explain something. The explanandum is the theory you're trying to explain. Substance dualism has no explanation. They just declare that we have this sort of box that we're going to call an immaterial mind, and we're going to throw in the things that we wanted to explain. And one of them is that it causally interacts with the physical mind, for interactionist dualism at least. And then so they just say that that happens, and they have no theory for how it could possibly happen. And when called out on this point that, look, this is really implausible given everything else we know, they just say, oh, well, you're just assuming that physicalism is true. Well, no, we're not assuming that. We're taking all of the knowledge that we do have from the physical sciences and highlighting the fact that it's wildly inconsistent with what you're saying and very hard to make sense of what you're saying in the light of this knowledge, and asking you to respond to this, what apparently amounts to really reducing the plausibility of your explanation. So I don't think there's any presumption of anything here. It's simply that the ineptitude and complete substancelessness of substance dualism is why scientists can't say anything about it. It's not because they, like, in principle, won't touch anything that's labeled like non-physical. It's just because there's nothing to do or say about it, because there's no theory there. And this point here, if one presupposes physicalism, does it make sense to conclude that there are no non-physical causes? That's just not true. What we know from the physical sciences strongly support the idea that there are no non-physical causes outside of it. Like, just to think about how ridiculous this claim is, right? This is saying that, suppose, this is maybe an imperfect example, and I'm trying to come up with one on the fly. Suppose that you study birds, you're an ornithologist, and you're having a look at the different species that live in a particular habitat. You say, oh, there's different types of birds here, and then you find a mammal species, like, and you say, oh, well, this is not a bird, therefore it mustn't exist. Like, this is fake. This isn't real. No, an ornithologist doesn't say that non-birds don't exist. Obviously, they know that non-birds don't exist. They just don't study them. So hopefully you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying here. Scientists don't need to say that just because they only study the physical world doesn't mean that they would necessarily think that nothing non-physical exists. In fact, plenty of scientists do believe that. So the claim is not that we should think that causal closure is true because it's all that science can explain. That's not the point at all. That's like saying that we should think that only birds exist because that an ornithologist should only think birds exist because they only study birds. No, that's not the point at all. The point is that from what we know from science, it's very implausible that there could be any causal influences from outside the physical world. It's not because it's what science study. It's because of what they found out that we know that it's very plausible. Like, as far as we know, causal closure holds. It could be, like in a hypothetical alternate universe, it could be that we found strong evidence that causal closure doesn't hold. Maybe we did experiments with parapsychology and found robust evidence for telekinesis or something. Maybe we found robust evidence for some sort of immaterial elan vital that innovates cells to make them alive, that can't be reduced to complex organic chemical interactions, right? Like, there's all sorts of possibilities that we could have discovered that would mean that science only studies the physical, but still knows that there are other non-physical things out there that have an effect on it. It's just that they don't study those. Like, that's entirely possible, and we could have discovered that, but we haven't. And in fact, overwhelmingly, what we found is that everything that can be explained physically, and that there isn't really any obvious room for non-physical explanations. So this argument here is so ridiculously silly, in my view. It completely misunderstands the force of the causal closure argument. The force of the causal closure argument isn't just that we think that we only believe in things what science study, and that science doesn't study non-physical things, therefore we can't believe that there's anything non-physical. No. The idea is that we want to take seriously the results of science. Science will study anything that it can, it won't arbitrarily exclude things because of how they're labeled, but anything that can allow us to construct mechanistic theories that can be empirically tested, right? And it's done that for hundreds of years across a wide range of areas. And it's found no evidence at all for any type of non-physical processes that can causally affect the physical world. Hasn't 100% ruled it out, but the theory we have now and the results we have now really strongly mitigate against it. And so that constitutes very strong evidence that causal closure holds, certainly at the very least in the case of physical minds and in like human bodies. You could argue maybe does it hold at the very origins of the universe or something, but that's not really wholly relevant. So you see what I'm saying here? I think this response here completely misconstrues the causal closure argument. And maybe the reason for this is because the way that substance dualists think about things is by thinking about their intuitions and extrapolating wildly, and kind of ignoring anything else. And it seems like that's what they're projecting onto the physicalists. And to be fair, there are physicalists who maybe do that as well. But I think physicalists are usually a lot more interested in what science actually has to say about things. Certainly I am. And I would say, look, it has nothing to do with pre-committing to physicalism or pre-committing to only believing that what scientists study exists. No, it's that what we know from science tells us that the causal closure is overwhelmingly likely to be true, and that there's just no room or no plausible room for any causal processes to exist outside of that. So I think that this response is totally off base and misconstrues the force of the causal closure argument. Yeah, this philosophy is to scientists as ornithology is to birds. I don't really agree with that quote, by the way, but it certainly has something to. I mean, I think bad philosophy is kind of like that, right? This sort of philosophy is useless to scientists, but I actually think that there's no real clear distinction between theoretical science and philosophy. Like that, they just merge into each other. Look at this in any discipline, like philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics, philosophy of chemistry, philosophy of mind. They all just merge in a continuum into the actual scientific practice in theoretical scientific practice in those disciplines. But anyway, that's one of the reasons I reject this sort of distinction between like science and philosophy and like, oh, we only believe what physical science says. Like there's not really a demarcation anyway. But anyways, sorry, Nathan, you're saying quite a lot here. Are some fields kind of like these are some fields, I presume you mean like a quantum field, kind of like these weird non-mechanistic seeming processes, but then energy entropy is still conserved, right? Well, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're saying there, but the point is that we know an awful lot about how the physical substrate of the world behaves. We have the standard model of fundamental physics. We know about the four forces. We know about the three generations of matter and fermions and bosons and the strength of these forces. We can make very specific predictions. We can make theoretical links between a wide variety of different phenomena. Obviously, there's still issues. We don't know how to interpret quantum mechanics very well, and we don't have a theory that links gravity to the other forces, a quantum theory of gravity. So there's still big issues there, but we know an awful lot. And so I think, and also what we know is that from my point of view, all of the other phenomena that are studied scientifically can ultimately be understood in terms of physical processes of like protons and electrons and neutrons mostly doing their thing, right? To make up atoms, which make up chemicals, which make up life and on and on. So there's a lot to be said here. Whereas what does a substance dualist have? They got nothing. There's no theory. There's nothing to say. There's no reductions. There's no mechanisms. There's no predictions. It's zilch across the board. There's no progress in the theorizing. So that's what I'm contrasting here. I don't think you have to have a full and entirely worked out theory of the nature of physical matter to be able to contrast the explanatory depth and success of the different theories, and to say that if something is inconsistent with our fundamental physical theories, that's a pretty damn good reason to be very skeptical about that. And you better have very strong evidence to contrast that. To offset that. And I mean, well, we looked at the evidence for substance dualism in the previous video, and it's all thought experiments, right? And intuitions. It's crap. Like, it's so bad. But anyways, is that the real digital gnosis? No way. No, I actually have a bot version that just appears on my stream. So this is the fake version. Did that. How much more causal closure do I want to talk about? Yeah, look, I'm just going to skip this because I think I've made my point about causal closure. And let's talk about, I think it's the final objection, conservation of energy. Yep. Okay. Last one here. So this is very closely related to causal closure. It's conservation arguments. So here's Searle here. So it seems impossible to make substance dualism consistent with modern physics. Physics says that the amount of matter and energy is constant, but substance dualism implies that there's some other type of energy, mental or spiritual energy, that is not fixed by physics. So if substance dualism is true, there seems to be one of the most fundamental laws of physics, the conservation of energy, must be false. So this is a similar point. It's just appealing to conservation of energy rather than causal closure. So it's a slightly different appeal, but it's a similar underlying point. We have this result very strongly emerging from physics, which is confirmed by a huge range of evidence, theoretical, empirical evidence, and consistency with other observed results from other sciences, right? It would take a lot to convince us that this was wrong. And so that stands as strong evidence against interaction of substance dualism, unless they can come up with a good explanation as to how to work around it. And, spoiler alert, they don't. But let's see what they have to say about this. This is a very unfortunate picture, by the way. So this is Robin Collins. I've actually had some interaction with him about the fine-tuning argument. Unlike most of the philosophers featured here, Robin Collins does actually know something about physics, which is somewhat refreshing. But I think that the point he's making here is not very convincing. So let's have a look at this. Let me, oops, no, oh, I accidentally deleted the comment. Oh no. Show comment is right next to delete. Oh dear, I'm sorry, level 5. So this is an interesting conundrum. I've deleted the comment. So how do I unshow it? I guess I have to show another comment. So anyway, the soul sucks up some energy from time to time to conserve it, and then it can use it. I mean, I think that might actually be the best response, right? But then that raises a further interaction problem. Like, how does it store energy? And energy is actually closely related to entropy, which relates to the number of distinct internal states that a system can have. So if you're going to say that an immaterial soul somehow has energy or can store and then use energy, I think it's hard to reconcile that with the notion that a soul is ultimately simple, because it seems like it must have internal differentiating states that correspond to the energy that it has. But that's far more than most of these people ever think about it. So, okay, there we go. Conservation disproved by unminifiable comment. Yeah. Oh dear, conservation of comments in chat. So let's look at what Robin Collins has to say here. This is it's a more interesting response than most of them, which is just like the, oh yeah, tu quoque response. So here's what he has to say. General relativity, but you weren't expecting to hear about that in a discussion of philosophy of mind. General relativity presents a major problem for energy conservation. The problem is that no local concept of stress energy, hence energy or momentum, can be defined for the gravitational field in general relativity. Consequently, the boundary version does not typically apply in general relativity. I'm not sure exactly what he means by boundary version. So typically one can neither define the local gravitational energy in a region of space, nor the rate at which gravitational energy flows into or out of a region. This implies that gravitational fields and wave causally influence material objects in quantifiable ways. Their influence cannot be understood in terms of movement of energy through space. Is that the... Yeah, okay. So this is one response that David gives. It's not the only one. So this is basically saying that the concept of the global energy content of the universe is not well defined in general relativity. I don't fully understand this, despite having done my best to work through the math of general relativity, or at least some of it. But part of this relates to the idea that there's no unique frame of reference to define energy in. So this is an unsolved problem in science as to how to understand conservation of energy in the light of general relativity. And my guess is that we're not going to get a resolution until we get a quantum theory of gravity. Goodness knows when that will happen. So I guess the question, so I don't really disagree with this from a physics point of view, but the question would be, what relevance does it have to interaction as substance dualism? Because when we're talking about the relationship between mind and body, we're talking about the interaction between an immaterial mind and a human body, like, the one that I have here. We're not talking about cosmology. So conservation of energy can be defined, sorry, let me say that again. Conservation of energy is known to hold locally through all of the types of physical interactions we know about. The trouble is defining it globally, like across large regions of space and time, but it's not a local problem. So locally, we know that conservation of energy holds. Globally, it's tricky to define. And it seems like it's the local aspect that's important here. I mean, remember what was said before, that if you think that a soul exists at a precise physical location in our body, we only need to worry about conservation of energy there, right? Or maybe you think it's like equally co-located across our brain or something. Whatever you think, it's only those places where we have to worry about conservation of energy. And conservation of energy is going to be relevant to whatever causal processes allow the mind to interact with the electrochemical substrate of the brain. So I just don't really see how this problem with defining global conservation of energy in a general relativistic context is really relevant. The most I can see is that it's like a slimmer of a plausibility argument that maybe there's something else going on that is more to conservation of energy than we would think. But it just seems really weak to me because the context is entirely different. And what we're talking about in the conservation of energy in the case of the mind and the brain is really a local phenomenon. It's not global phenomena. So I just don't find this very convincing. Next point. What exactly justifies the most serious claim that energy is something that was never created in the first place? In light of our impoverished knowledge of, say, dark energy and dark matter, there seems to be, I think this is a mistake, by the way, because this is the same book, so I don't know who this is. But anyway, there seems to be no good reason to think that the conservation and laws in general provide us with any empirical ground to establish the closure of physical domain thesis. Even if we had adequate knowledge of dark energy and dark matter, the question of whether the universe is causally closed remains something that requires a metaphysical basis, not just an empirical one. Again, this is the philosophical answer, or at least bad philosophy. It basically just says, well, we've got all this overwhelming empirical evidence that at least local conservation of energy holds. But I'm just going to ignore that and just sit in my armchair and think about the metaphysical basis of this claim. Whatever that could possibly mean. Like, what is the metaphysical basis of energy conservation? No, I'm not saying that, I don't go as far as some and say that philosophy is useless. Like, yeah, you need metaphysics. It has a place. But the place of metaphysics should be to help us understand and interpret science, not to just ignore science and then sit on our armchair and think about conservation of energy independently of any scientific results. That's just ridiculous. Like, what are you even talking about? So this is just, again, it's saying, I don't care. I'm not going to believe it, right? It's asking us to ignore all this overwhelming evidence that local conservation of energy holds because we just need to sit on our armchairs and think about it, I guess. Like, that's what else is a metaphysical basis supposed to mean here? I mean, an empirically minded philosopher like me is going to say, well, the metaphysical basis is all the scientific evidence that you have that this holds. Like, what other basis could you have? Like, I mean, this is obviously going to relate to a whole bunch of other disputes in philosophy, like how much a priori versus a posteriori you are. But anyway, I don't think this is a very convincing response at all. Now, let me also mention dark matter and dark energy. What relevance does that have to the mind-body problem? I agree that there are outstanding scientific issues, but I mean, do we think that dark energy somehow relates to the mind-body problem? Seems very implausible that it would, right? Is there a reason to think that it does? It seems like it's just saying, oh, look, there's something else we don't know about. And it's just changing the subject. It's a version of the tu quoque, right? Oh, yeah, but you scientists can't explain dark matter and dark energy. So, yeah, like, it's irrelevant. There's no reason to think that dark matter and dark energy have anything to do with the mind, or like the processes that give rise to the mind. They're relevant to explaining certain cosmological phenomena, like the rate of expansion of the universe and rotation of galaxies and things. That they have significant effects on such a local scale is very unlikely. And it's also very unlikely that they violate the conservation of energy. I mean, in fact, what we know about them is entirely because of the matter and energy content that they have and the effects gravitational that they have on other matter in the universe. Anyway, so I think that this is just it's a red herring by raising dark matter and dark energy, and then a refusal to actually address the issue of, hey, we have really strong evidence for conservation of energy, and sort of just ignoring that. Sorry about this slide here. I got lazy and just put it all in one because I didn't want to have two slides here. So this is a different response by Collins here, which I think is more interesting. So he's saying here that the energy conservation objection is predicated on the idea that causal interaction requires an exchange of energy. So if there's an interaction between the immaterial mind and the physical body, it's going to require some exchange of energy. So he says, look, apart from the general relativity point, which we talked about, he says it's problematic within contemporary physics for a separate reason, because quantum mechanics allows for interactions that don't involve exchange of energy or momentum. Now, when I read that, I'm like, huh? What are you talking about? Every interaction that I know of in quantum mechanics involves exchange of energy and momentum. In fact, those are tied together in relativity, because it depends on your sort of frame of reference. But energy and momentum will be exchanged in every interaction that I know of, as well as other properties like spin, for example. There's other quantum numbers too, charge, that's also conserved. So he's saying that there can be interactions that don't have any exchange of energy. Now, I don't think that's true. At least I'm not aware of any examples. But so what example is he giving here? Well, so he says, in quantum mechanics, there are law-like correlations between attributes of distantly separated particles without energy exchange. These quantum correlations show that postulating an interaction, or at least a correlation between the mind and the brain, does not involve an energy exchange or other mediating field. Okay, so I have to... this is very frustrating, because what he's talking about here, I'm almost completely sure of, is quantum entanglement. Because he says here that there are law-like correlations between attributes of distantly separated particles. So that he's talking about the idea that if you like prepare a system which will generate two electrons, one spin up and one spin down, and you separate them by a large distance, you then measure one of, like, you know that one is spin up and the other spin down, but you don't know which is which. You separate them by a large distance, you measure the spin of one of them, you find it spin up. Immediately you know with certainty, or certain as you can get within your measurement errors, right, that the other one is spin down, even if it's a light year away, right? So this is what he's talking about by correlations between attributes of distantly separated particles. And his point is these correlations don't require any signal to pass or any interaction to occur between these separated particles. And that's true. The correlations don't require that. And this is what's sometimes called like spooky action at a distance, right? But the thing is here, and he himself obviously knows this because he says, postulating that an interaction or at least a correlation between the mind and the brain does not involve an energy exchange, it has precedent. But there's a whole world of difference, at least many people think, I should say, that there's a whole world of difference between a correlation and a causal interaction. So there are some understandings of the laws of physics. This harkens back to what was asked about before, about what is it that makes a causal, where do physical laws live, so to speak. If you think that that all laws of physics are just descriptive correlations, then maybe you don't draw a distinction between these correlations due to quantum entanglement and other physical processes. But like, honestly, I don't even think you need to appeal to that, because it's well known and he knows this, right, that there's a big difference between correlations due to quantum entanglement and any type of interaction process. They're just different physical processes. Like one of them can exchange energy and matter, one can't. One of them can exert a causal effect on the other, one can't. One can exchange information from one place to another, the other can't. Right? They're just entirely different things. And any theory that anyone has about how the immaterial mind can affect the body, it can do something to the body, it's going to require more than some sort of quantum entanglement correlation, because there's no cause there. It's not a causal process, right? In a particular, when you're measuring one particle as being spin up or spin down, that particle isn't affecting the other particle. It's just a correlation, right? It's not like you can make one spin up and then that makes the other spin down. That's not how it works. It's random, and then the other one will be also random, but correlated with the first one. If you're going to call that, like, independent of how we define laws of physics, if you're going to put that in the same basket as causal effects, then any type of necessary correlation, at least physically necessary correlation, you'd also put in the same category. And this is actually a big objection to these sort of Humean arguments, is because there are many sort of accidental correlations that can exist. Like, I think one that's often given in the literature is that every organism that has a liver has a kidney or something. I can't actually remember which one it is. So I probably butchered that. But like, the point is that there's lots of correlations that exist in the world, and a lot of them are going to be like just sort of accidental ones that don't actually have anything fundamentally to do with what's the underlying processes, right? And the interactions of this sort, like quantum entanglement, is a special type of very interesting process, but it's not a causal process. It's completely different to any of the other types of quantum processes that we're talking about that exchange energy and momentum. Anything that I would say that reasonably can be described under the banner of a causal process exchanges matter exchanges energy and momentum. And quantum entanglements just aren't it, right? So to postulate that the interaction between mind and body is some kind of quantum entanglement-like process, it's ridiculous. It's just not a causal process. That's actually analogous to a different position in philosophy of mind, a different version of dualism called parallelism, which is the idea that you've got the brain and it does its stuff, and then you've got the mind and it does its stuff, and they kind of exist parallel to each other and mirror each other in some way. But they don't interact with each other. That's closer to, I think, what this what's being said here. It is like there's a correlation between these states, but they're not actually interacting with each other. Because again, when you talk about the spin up and spin down electrons, they're not interacting with each other. There's just a correlation in their states. That's all it is. It's a correlation that can be reliably inferred by measuring one, but it's not an interaction, not a causal process. You can't transmit energy, you can't transmit information through that process. So I just don't see how it's relevant to explain the sort of interaction that substance dualists want to have between mind and brain. Yeah, this is it. All creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. And whether it's true or not it's like one of these, it's like the C fibers firing, right? Like the philosophers don't care about whether it's true. I just thought of that because it's just an example that's used in the literature to indicate that like it's not obvious that all correlations are created equal, so to speak, in terms of explaining and accounting for why things are in the world, or why things are the way they are in the world, and that a bunch of correlations may be just sort of accidental, incidental. Anyway, but I don't even know that you need to appeal to that in this particular case. I just think it's the wrong sort of process here. Okay, so then, so we've got quite a few different responses here to the conservation of energy problem. So we've got, notice how there's this smorgasbord response strategy here. It's just like throw everything at the wall. Okay, so we've got general relativity can't define global conservation of energy. I've said that that's not really relevant because it's local that's relevant. And then we've got, look, why should we think that energy is conserved anyway? That's a physical principle. We're in the care about metaphysics here. Well, I think that's just a cop-out. You're making physical claims that have physical effects. You need to address the evidence that's relevant there. Then we've got, well, you've got correlations between quantum entangled particles, but that's not actually a causal or interaction process. That's just a correlation. So I don't think that's relevant. Now we've got yet another type of response here. Minds neither add energy nor subtract, or abstract it. Shouldn't that be subtract from the body? I think abstract can mean subtract in this context. But anyway, what they do, if they do anything, is to determine that at a given moment, so much energy shall change from the chemical form to the form of bodily movement. And they determine this, so far as we can see, without altering the total amount of energy in the physical world. Again, let's put this into the folder of things that only a philosopher could say. How is it that a non-physical substance is supposed to determine or make it to be the case that energy changes from a chemical form to bodily movement? Does this guy have any idea about how bodily movement happens? Does he know about the different fibers? The what is it, actin and myosin fibers that move relative to each other in our skeletal muscles that allow it to them to contract, thereby pulling on the ligaments that pull on the bones that move our limbs, right? And that it's actually an interplay of chemical processes and calcium ions that trigger this process, and it's all powered by ATP, which provides the energy to pull these filaments relative to each other, right? The point is that this sequence of chemical and physical processes constantly involves interchange of types of energy, from different types of potential energy to a chemical potential energy, electrical potential energy, mechanical energy. That's constantly changing energy. Where's the soul fit into that? There's just no room for the soul there. What? So this guy is just spouting nonsense. This is a scientifically illiterate statement. It doesn't make any sense. It's just saying, that, look, they don't change, they don't add or subtract energy anyway. They just somehow change the way that energy is moving around. Well, how do you do that without adding or subtracting energy? Like, that's just not how physics, that's not how anything works. Like, what are you talking about? So that's just gibberish as far as I can tell. Behavior is confirmed. Behavior is important. It's just that there's internal mental behavior, right? We'll talk about this. I think this is more gibberish, right? So what's this one saying? I've forgotten this slide here. We're not sure anyone has tried to look for such energy. Okay, so he's saying that, like, suppose that an exercise of active power involved in a free action does in fact involve creation of mental energy, like in the brain or wherever. Why have we not detected an increase in energy that results from such free action? We're not sure anyone has tried to look for such energy, but it's plausible that it may be so slight and insignificant that it can't be detected. So this was a point they made before. Maybe it's too small to detect. Think of a massive amount of energy in the water held back by a Hoover Dam. Now, suppose someone flips a switch with his finger and this opens the dam, releasing all that potential energy. It doesn't actually release the potential energy. The potential energy will be converted into kinetic energy as the water accelerates. Anyway, the energy it took to flip the switch is real, but so small compared to the energy released by the dam opening that it would be undetectable. This may well be that what is going on with mental causation that triggers releases of clarity of large amounts of potential energy stored in the brain and body. I think this is slightly more reasonable than what this guy said, but only slightly. So again, we have to acknowledge that it's always possible that there is some effects of some sort of immaterial substance that does cause release energy or consume energy or some way in the brain that's too small and idiosyncratic for us to detect, right? That's always possible. This is Russell's teapot argument, right? You can always say that there's a teapot between the orbits of, what is it, Jupiter and Saturn or wherever it was supposed to be, but it's too small for us to detect. So how can you say it's not there? It might be, right, for all we know. Not a very convincing argument, but it is possible, right? So why should we think that this isn't the case? Well, the reason that we should think this isn't the case is because the brain is not a Hoover Dam, right? So the problem with all of these responses is that they don't actually discuss anything about brains. And I suspect it's because these people either don't know or just don't care about how brains work. A brain is just like a lump of jelly to these people. A brain is, well, it's a bunch of things there, but the most relevant parts are the neurons, which are electrochemically active cells. The mental activity in the brain is at the very least partly caused, I would say totally caused, but sorry, let me say that again. Yeah, mental activity is at the very least partly caused, I would say totally caused, but even the substance dualists, they say it's partly caused by electrochemical processes in neural networks, right? So what we have to address here is where the energy is supposed to come from and how it intervenes in the system. So this comes back to my question from before. How is it that an immaterial substance can change the ion concentration across the cell membrane of neurons in the brain, and not only in general, but do that in a way that leads to like reliably specific changes in our behavior? Now, you could argue that, look, it only needs to do this in a small part of the basal ganglia or something to influence whether we choose A or B, like left or right. Maybe it's just a tiny bit of an increase in activity in the one relative to the other that determines where the decision is made, and then everything else that happens is just the physical processes. I don't actually think that works, because that might account for like decision making, but it won't account for consciousness, because we know that consciousness is closely related to, and I would say caused by, distributed activity across the cortex. So if we think that there's something that the soul does to allow us to be conscious, then the soul's going to have to be interacting with a wide swath of neurons across the brain in a continual way, not just a few little nuclei somewhere in the basal ganglia choosing whether we go left or right when we're making a decision or whatever. So I don't think that argument really applies. But even if you say that, look, it's interacting across the cortex, but each point is so small, the amount of energy that it's changing, so that we can't measure it. I haven't done the maths there to know whether that could be true or not. I suspect that's probably not true, because like, how do you change an ion concentration without either adding or subtracting ions? And like, to do that consistently across the brain to change the activity would be a lot of ions. Like, I just don't know how that's supposed to work. Where are they going? Where are they coming from? I think we would have observed that, at least in some context. Maybe not. Maybe God's hiding it from us. I don't freaking know. But the point is that there's just no theory here. It's not just that we haven't observed it. It doesn't appear that there's any room for it to happen, or any theory for how it could happen. Where do the ions come from? Where do they go? What is exactly the soul doing to the, what does it need to do? There's an assumption here that the soul needs to interact with the brain in some way to exert a causal effect on it. But we run into what's called an overdetermination problem. I think I skipped on this a little bit earlier, but like, it seems that everything that needs to happen in the brain can be explained by other causes in the brain. So what is exactly that's missing that the soul needs to do? It's sort of unclear. I mean, is it consciousness that's missing? But then like, what does the soul need to do to the brain to make it conscious? Like, there's no theory here. It's again, we've put consciousness in the bucket of things that we want our substance dualism to explain. We haven't actually made any theory. We've just collected a bunch of stuff in our bucket and called it substance dualism. That's what the theory is. It's a bunch of desiderata in a bucket labeled substance dualism. And that's the problem. That's why conservation of energy is an issue here, because they just don't have any theory for how it could even in principle work in a way that is consistent with scientific laws. To say that, oh, well, it's small and insignificant in some way that it can't be detected, doesn't address the problem. The question is, how can it happen? In principle, you could even calculate, given certain assumptions, like how big the effect would be and whether it would have been observed in, because we've done a lot of studies with people who have electrodes implanted in neurons into their brains. Now we don't know the full activity that they're receiving from other neurons. So it's sort of unclear whether that would be sufficient to like rule out an external effect here, but just no one who's studied nervous systems has, to my knowledge, observed anything that would even provide a space for this sort of interaction to occur. So yes, we can say that it's theoretically possible, but the plausibility is just not there. There's no theory that would allow us to explain how it could even happen, let alone ways to make it predictable, to make it testable, I mean. All right, so that's conservation of energy. My brain is a lump of jelly with big hydrous gaps in the ventricles. Well, that's kind of normal, right? You just want to make sure that there's like, electrical activity occurring in the lump of jelly, and not just TikTok memes or something. Okay, so let's just do a quick revision of what we've talked about in the last two videos. So arguments for dualism. So the first argument appealed to the nature of the self, so the unity of the self over time. the identity over time and the indivisibility of the self, the idea that you can't like break the self up into pieces. And I argued that that's not a very convincing argument, largely because we can, we can challenge some of the intuitions that underpin the notion of unity of self, for example. How unified is it really? And there's various cases where that seems to break down. I highlighted some of those. And in terms of identity and indivisibility, I highlighted that this is a broad issue for any type of entity that exists as to how it maintains its identity over time, the ship of Theseus thing. And there's a variety of solutions there. The naturalist can just, the physicalist about the mind can just pick their favorite solution and apply it to the mind. Now, I want to respond to something that was mentioned in the comments here, which is to say that I think that this is probably what a lot of substance dualists, it seems that a lot of substance dualists are mereological nihilists about physical objects, which means they basically say there's no fact of the matter about what makes one physical object the same at one point in time over another. It's all convention. Now, it's interesting because I tend to agree with that view, not exactly, but close to that view. Though it's a relatively unpopular view philosophically. But the thing is that it seems like the substance dualists want to say that mereological nihilism is true for all composite entities, but because of the strong intuitions they have about being identical over time, that means the self must not be a composite entity, so it has to be simple. And I think in that case, if you just really think that you are identical to yourself over time, then you're going to favor substance dualism over any alternative, because there isn't really another theory that can give you that. I think that we should reject the notion of identity over time and talk about continuity. And I would question why we even need identity. And I don't think that any of the arguments that are given for it show identity. They only show continuity. But if you're just so convinced that you are identically the same as a person over time, then I think that substance dualism will make more sense than any alternative theory. I just don't think that there's a good reason to hold that. Anyway, so I just wanted to add a little footnote to that one. Then there was the argument from introspection, which was mostly an appeal to the apparent inconsistent properties between physical brains and immaterial, actually not immaterial at this point, but just the alleged incompatibility of mental properties with physical properties. This was the idea that like the color red exists in your mind, but like you can't find the color red in your brain, and related ideas like that. And I think that this is better phrased as an incompatible property argument rather than an introspection argument. And the ultimate problem here is that it assumes that by introspecting about the nature of mental properties, that we can somehow also gain knowledge of physical, or that we also have equivalent knowledge of physical properties. So you might be able to, maybe you think that you have introspective access to at least some mental states. I think that's plausible. At least some mental states we can introspect about, and we have knowledge of their natures. But that doesn't mean we have, it doesn't follow that we have insight into all aspects, that they're entirely transparent. And I think that's the key assumption that's being made in the introspection argument, that the dualist is saying that we can introspect all aspects of our mental, at least some of our mental states, and determine from that introspection that those mental states are not physical states in any way. And I simply reject that. The question is, how do you do that? It's just sort of asserted that can be done. Now, the physicalist is going to say we can introspect about some of the properties of our mental states, but it's their ultimate nature is not transparent to us, that we can't tell whether they're ultimately what we're introspecting are ultimately physical states, which are like instantiated as complex brain states. That's what the physicalist says, that's what we're actually introspecting. We're introspecting at a brain state. We just don't realize it's a brain state. How would we know, right? How would we know whether our mental state could be a brain state? You'd have to sort of somehow exhaustively know all properties of physical entities, and then compare those to the properties that you introspect in your mind, right? Like the properties of your experience. But we don't have exhaustive physical knowledge of everything that exists in the world. So it's not like we're in a position to compare and say, oh, this couldn't be physical. Our experiences can't be physical because we know that physical objects don't have these properties. Well, actually, we don't know that, right? The physicalist precisely says that we might think that that's true, but we're mistaken. They are actually, all these experiences just are actually physical states. You just didn't realize it because your introspection isn't that good, bro. So that's essentially where that argument comes down to. Now, the modal argument or the appeal to zombies, basically this amounts to, this is a modal argument because it appeals to possibilities. So it's saying that it's possible. Well, actually, let me take a step back. The modal argument says that it's conceivable that there could be, for example, a physical duplicate of you. There could be a physical duplicate of your body that didn't have your mind, or that was unconscious, let's say, that had no consciousness. So that's a P zombie, a philosophical zombie. Or other variants, like I think David mentions, like swapping minds between bodies and other things. So all of these are conceivable. If something is conceivable in a certain way, then therefore it's possible. And if it's possible that you can have a copy of your body that doesn't have a mind, then physicalism is false, because physicalism says that minds are just produced by, or they're part of your body in some sense. And therefore you can't have a copy of a precise physical duplicate of a body that wouldn't also bring along the mind. So that's the essence of the modal argument. And the problem I argue there is that the main problem is in outlining a notion of conceivability sufficiently strong to enable us to rule out just like not having enough knowledge of something. So like, well, maybe you just don't have enough information to conceive of, to realize that P zombies are not in fact conceivable, or maybe you haven't thought about it hard enough. So they have to strengthen the notion of conceivability to say like, well, it's not actual conceivability, it's ideal conceivability for someone who had like all the facts and thought about it very carefully, and that not just sort of conceived of it vaguely, but conceived of it like very specifically and clearly and so forth. So they strengthen up the conceivability so much that in order to link it to possibility, because then the claim is, look, just vaguely thinking about something doesn't make it possible. There's lots of examples that you give of things that might seem conceivable, but are actually not possible because you hadn't thought about it clearly enough, or you didn't know enough about it. So in order to draw this link closer, they need to strengthen conceivability. Proponents of this argument make the conceivability really strong. It's not just conceivability, it's idealized, like specific, and there's a few other factors I forget. It's like idealized, clear, specific conceivability implies possibility. And okay, maybe we'll grant that. But then the question is, we don't have that form of conceivability. It's hypothetical, because no one has all the relevant knowledge about the physical states of the body and how they relate to the mind. So the modal argument is really not very useful, because it really just says that in a hypothetical state of affairs where we did imagine such and such a thing in such and such a way, then that would prove that it was possible. But no one actually is in that epistemic state, because we don't know enough. We don't know all those things. We can't work through all of the implications of our beliefs and get outside our biases and so forth. So I think it's just a useless argument. And the last one, the knowledge argument. So this was the Mary's room argument, the idea that Mary's a neuroscientist who understands all of the facts about color vision and optics and whatever else, but she's colorblind. She's never seen color before. And then she walks out of her lab for the first time and sees a rose and sees the redness of the rose, and for the first time she experiences what it's like to see color. And the idea is that she's learned something new that she didn't know before, even though she knew all the physical facts. And this means that there must be something to conscious experience of color or whatever else that extends beyond the physical facts. There's something non-physical to it. This is probably the most popular argument for, at least against physicalism in the literature, and I don't think it's a very convincing one. There's a lot of different responses. My favorite response is to essentially agree that Mary, the neuroscientist, does learn something new, does learn a new fact when she goes outside and sees red for the first time. She learns the phenomenal concept of what it is like to experience red. The reason that she didn't know that before is because phenomenal concepts are a particular type of mental representation that can only be acquired through experience, through actually being in a particular state. You don't acquire phenomenal concepts by reading scientific facts from a book or equations or whatever else. This isn't often discussed, but the idea here is essentially that in order to acquire that type of representation of what it would be like to experience red, you would need to not just have like a list of all the physical facts about optics and brain and functions and so on. Even if you memorize them all, that's not the same thing as being in that physical state. What you would need to do is like somehow have a simulation of that exact state in your brain, which you somehow experience. So in other words, you would need to like simulate them all in your brain and be in that state to then have that experience. And that's probably not even possible, because how can you can't be the simulation in your brain and you at the same time. I don't know that would really work. So the point is that the phenomenal concept defense says that she does learn something new. She learns something new because the physical state of being, the physical state of affairs of seeing the color red is fully explicable in terms of a physical state, third-person objective physical fact. But there's different ways of sort of mentally representing or sort of looking at that state of affairs. And Mary didn't have the right type of way of representing that brain state when she just knew the physical facts from inside the room, like the scientific description from inside the room. In order to represent it in the right way, she needed to be in the right type of physical state. She needed to configure her brain into the right configuration to represent that that stimuli correctly. The only way to do that, at least as far as we know, is because of the limits of how human brains work, is to experience it yourself, to go outside and actually see the red thing. Maybe through some weird sort of mental simulation technology, you could do it as well. But that's beyond the thought experiment, right? Just reading a bunch of facts about something is not going to be enough. It's nothing to do with the actual reality of the brain state. It's like it doesn't show that there's anything non-physical to the state of seeing color. It's just about how Mary is representing that state in her brain. If it's just a list of descriptive facts, that's not going to get you to the phenomenal concept. You need to actually put your brain in the right configuration by experiencing that thing yourself. That's essentially the idea. And I don't really think there's anything deeply implausible about that. You don't need to invoke any sort of mystical, like phenomenal, non-physical phenomenal properties or something like that, which also don't really explain anything either. All right, now the arguments against dualism. So the origin and nature of souls. So we didn't actually talk too much about the origin of souls, but we talked about the nature of souls, like what is a soul supposed to be? How can we account for it? What differentiates one soul from another? And we saw that there aren't really good answers to this. The response is mostly tu quoque, like, oh yeah, but you can't explain this for physicalism. And we talked about the differences there, that actually physicalists do have a lot they can say about the origin and nature of different physical bodies in terms of causal processes and physical histories. So that's a big mystery there. There's the interaction problem. So how does the soul interact with the physical brain? There's really just no answer to this. Again, it's just like, yeah, but we can know that something happens without knowing how it happens. There's not an acknowledgement here that there's a deep implausibility here because of the fact that physical theories and everything we know about brains don't allow for this type of interaction. And there's no theory of how it could happen, even in principle. So that's a huge problem. The pairing problem is related. Why is it that one soul interacts with one body and only and specifically that body? How does that work? What are the principles there? The only plausible response to this that David provided was to say that a immaterial soul could be co-located with a specific body. It could occupy a physical location and move around with the body. Now that I think would address the pairing problem, but it introduces a new and deeper version of the interaction problem, because now we not only need to have the immaterial mind interacting with the brain in certain ways, like to whatever it's supposed to do, change the decisions we make or give rise to qualia. Again, it's sort of unclear. But in addition, it also has to interact with the body in a way that maintains its location relative to the body. So does that mean it feels the force of gravity or like the electrostatic forces that stop solid objects from passing through each other? Or is there a special force that keeps it like tied to part of the brain or wherever it's supposed to be? So it just raises a whole bunch of other interaction problems. Then there's the causal closure point. So we seem to have very strong evidence from physics and really all of science that everything that is every causal effect in the physical world has a physical cause. Oh, sorry. Everything that not saying this very well. Everything that has an effect on something else is a physical entity or process. That there's no non-physical causes that operate on things in the physical world. And the response to this was mainly like just sort of denying that that we have evidence for this and saying that it's just a bias to only believe things that science says, when in fact that's not the point at all. The point is that we have very strong reasons from scientific, really all sciences, that causal closure is true. So at the very least in the mind-brain case, and therefore we need a very strong reason to counter that, because mind-body dualism would say that it's not true, and so the inconsistency gives rise to an implausibility. So we need a response to that, and there just really isn't one. And then lastly, we had the conservation of energy. So this is related to causal closure, but it's a slightly different point. So we have strong evidence from science that that nature is, that energy is conserved in interactions. And it seems that if mind-body dualism was true, then it would have to not be conserved. There would have to be some sort of flow of energy or creation or destruction of energy when the immaterial mind interacted physically with the brain. And there's no evidence for that. There's no theory of how that could happen. It seems deeply implausible. And we had quite a lot of responses here. We had the appeal to the fact that you can't define global conservation of energy and general relativity, which seems irrelevant to me because we're talking about local conservation of energy. And we're not talking about general relativistic scales. There was the appeal to dark matter and dark energy. Well, they're kind of weird, so maybe the soul is weird too. Again, even though that's sort of entirely irrelevant and different phenomenon. And then we had the usual appeal to, well, why should we think that conservation of energy is true, right? That's just a presumption of you know, dogmatic physicalists. Again, just ignoring all of the evidence we have that the conservation of energy is true. And finally, the objection was, look, maybe conservation of energy is violated in interactions between the mind and the brain. However, maybe it's violated in small and sort of subtle ways that we can't detect or haven't detected so far. That's possible. We can't rule that out. But again, it's not so much that we just haven't observed it, although like it seems plausible that we would have. It seems if you actually tried to calculate this, I don't know if anyone has, but it seems to me that the amount of changes in the ion concentrations you would need potentially would be observable, but maybe it would be hard to design experiments to do that. I don't know. But even aside from that, it's not just that whether that's been observed or not, it's that we don't have any way to account for how it could happen. How is it that an immaterial soul is supposed to change the ion concentration of across membranes of neurons in a specific and targeted way to change the way that the neural networks function? Like, what's the theory there? We just have no room for that in our science. So to conclude, I think that the arguments for substance dualism are not very convincing. Almost all of them relate to thought experiments or hypothetical, like modal conceivabilities. And I think the physicalist has plausible responses to all of those. And all of the arguments against substance dualism relate fundamentally to the inability of substance dualism to provide any kind of explanatory theory about how anything is supposed to work, where souls come from, how they how they differentiate from each other, how they come attached to particular bodies and remain attached to them, how they interact with those bodies, how all that fits in with causal closure and conservation of energy. Literally nothing is explained. There's no theory here. There's no explanatory scope or depth. There's no plausibility relative to other scientific evidence. So what we have is substance dualism is a big box that certain philosophers of a certain mindset pick up their sort of pet theories about, you know, oh, consciousness seems hard to account for, and it seems like we have identity over time, and introspectively, it seems that there's different properties of mind and body, and, you know, it seems like zombies are conceivable. So we take these intuitions and we put the results that we want in this box, and then we call it substance dualism because it delivers the results that we want on all of these sort of intuitive or thought experiment issues. And we don't actually bother, from my point of view, developing any kind of explanatory theory that explains how any of this is supposed to work. And that's fundamentally why I reject substance dualism, because the arguments for it are weak from the outset. They're all just appeals to things that we don't have good reason to expect that we're reliable about anyway, just introspecting about the ultimate nature of consciousness. Why would you expect to have reliable beliefs about that? We can't even get reliable beliefs about basic perceptual phenomena and memory, for which we know that there are all sorts of illusions and deceptions that can occur very readily and we'll not be aware of them. So there's a prima facie reason to distrust all of those types of arguments. And even taking the arguments at face value, we've walked through them in detail, and we've shown that they are not convincing and that there are very plausible materialist or physicalist responses to all of them. So the arguments aren't good. But conversely, there are, I think, a host of issues that face substance dualism that they don't have plausible responses to because there just is no theory there. There's nothing to say about what these souls are or how they work or what they do or why they do that and not something else. Whereas we don't have every answer for physicalism or every answer about how everything works in the mind and the brain and the physical world generally. But we have this huge edifice of theory from science and supporting philosophy that tells us an awful lot about how these processes work. And nowhere in there is there any room for substance dualists. So for substance dualism to be true. So in conclusion, I don't find David's case as well put together in general that it was. I don't find it convincing, and I look forward to chatting with him hopefully soon, where we can nut out some of these issues in more detail. All right. So thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found that of value. Before signing off, I will just address a few comments. So Nathan here is saying, which I mean, I knew he would, that peak consciousness is so unspecified, I don't think we can conceive anything clearly. Yeah, I think, look, I have sympathy with that. I do think that we can operationally distinguish conscious mental states from non-conscious ones, and also non-conscious bodily states. So I think there's a phenomenon there. But I would agree that we should be very reticent to make any strong conclusions about just appealing to intuitions about that, because I don't think we have any justification for strong claims about how we can come to clear knowledge about. Like, it's hard enough to even define. But I don't go the full qualia or phenomenal consciousness, like eliminativism, because I think that we can operationally at least define the distinction between conscious and non-conscious states, and that there is something real there. But yeah, we need to be cautious about deploying a concept that's so underspecified and difficult to get a grip on. Yeah, we'll talk more about representation in our discussion, Nathan, so I'm going to leave that for now. Yeah, here's a point that I haven't really discussed much. David doesn't talk about this in his video, or only briefly mentions it. But there are also people, there are some substance dualists, like Braxton is one example, who use near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, as well as demonic possession, as evidence for substance dualism. And it seems like that if you take these experiences seriously and try to incorporate them into a substance dualist framework, you get even more problems that you have to address. Like a near-death experience or out-of-body experience is good examples here, because the idea is that someone leaves their body, right? Their soul leaves their body. Okay, let's suppose that a soul is located in your brain somewhere, as was stated, and it leaves it. I guess if it's physically located, it can move somehow, right? I don't know how it moves. I mean, what's propelling it? But it seems like every type of propulsion we know about involves ejecting particles or energy, so that equal and opposite reaction, so that the body moves in this direction. So I guess the soul has soul bits in it, soul propellant that it pushes out so it can leave the body. Like, I don't know how that's supposed to work, but anyway, it leaves the body, and then the person sees stuff that's happening in the room. Like they're up in the ceiling and they see things. How can a soul see? Like it has a receptor that detects photons and processes that to detect edges and colors and different objects, which it then integrates together in a scene. Like all the stuff that our brains do to process objects, which we have quite a lot of knowledge about these days in terms of the neuroscience and cognitive science of it. Somehow the soul does all that without the brain. It doesn't need the brain to do that. It forms that perception and stores it as a memory, because the person remembers it later, remember? So the soul has all that information stored in it. When it then somehow comes back to the body, and then I guess it ejects all of that stored spiritual knowledge, which somehow, by the way, was stored in an entity that's ultimately simple and has no internal parts. How you store information, which requires, differentiation of different possible mental scenes, and therefore requires a certain amount of entropy in it, which necessitates that it's not simple, but it's still somehow simple. And then somehow when it comes back into the brain, it then causally interacts with the brain in some way as to, like, I guess, consolidate or form that memory physically, even though it previously didn't need the brain to form that memory, because you remembered it when it wasn't connected to the brain. Like, how can anyone more than 6 years old take this seriously? Like, it's so stupid. I just can't wrap my head around it. Now, be clear that I'm talking specifically about out-of-body experience substance dualists, right? The regular type of substance dualism is nearly as silly, but there's just a whole host of extra problems if you want to try to explain out-of-body and near-death experiences on top of that. It's just baffling that people can actually take this argument seriously. But you have people like Gary Habermas, who actually put forward these near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences as evidence for an afterlife, and as evidence that there's more to a person than just the physical body. And this is, we've talked about this quite a bit on this with Nathan as well, about these sort of experiences. The evidence for them is just really weak as well. Like, that none of them are well documented, and when you well document them, you actually don't find that people remember anything that they couldn't reasonably have remembered themselves, like in a normal way. But even if you ignore that and just think about it conceptually, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no way to account for it. The only way you can make sense of it is to think that a soul doesn't need the body for anything. It can just do everything itself. It can perceive, it can think, it can remember, it can move around. And then you just wonder, well, what the hell is the body doing? Like, why even bother? It seems the soul just can do everything by itself. And then if you think God makes souls that can do everything themselves, but then he sticks them in bodies for no reason at all, which then get old and die. But like, what? How can people think that this is a coherent belief system? Anyway, so yeah, you get the point though, that like the more you try to add to this, beyond like the mere substance dualism, the more ridiculous it gets. And that's why many substance dualists try like the plague, try to avoid explaining anything or making specific claims like the plague, apart from rejecting materialism. So that's why almost all of their arguments are just really against materialism, or trying to say that there's some non-material aspect of consciousness or the mind or whatever. They almost never say anything very specific about how it's supposed to work, or what it accounts for, or what causal process is supposed to be involved, or what the brain is doing versus the soul is doing. Nothing is explained. That's why it's not a good theory. It's not a bad theory because it postulates a non-material mind per se. It's a bad theory because in postulating a non-material mind, that's the end of it. There's literally no other theory. It's just a label to describe a bunch of intuitions put in a box. And that is what makes it a bad theory. All right, got a bit worked up there, but I think that was worthwhile to mention. But I do want to clarify that I'm not saying that David Pallmann, whose video I'm responding to, is defending near-death experiences or anything like that. He hasn't expressed that, so I'm just expressing that as a further point. I want to be clear about that. All right, a few last points before we... So we did a 2-hour part 1, or maybe 3-hour part 1, and a 2-hour and 20-minute part 2. And now I'm getting asked, how do you define mind? Okay, go back to part 1 and start watching. You're about 5 hours late for that question. Oh dear. There's always one who's like, you get to the end, it's like, well, how did you define this thing at the start? Oh dear. Near-death experiences are when the universe glitches and shows you the death cam too early. Yeah, I think that there's some people who think like that there's some sort of camera that is like a God's eye view, and you can like, you use the right cheat code and you can get to see through it or something. Are these the people who complained that we like had no idea what we were talking about what's her name? The one that always gets quoted. I've forgotten her name, because I remember seeing that years ago, if that's the case. It was there's some people who get really butthurt if you talk about NDEs. I thought there was another comment I wanted to comment on here. Interaction problem. Ever heard of Psi-Commu? I'm not sure if that's a joke or not. I don't know what that refers to. Have you watched Emerson Green's video on the interaction problem? I have not. Should I? But remember, predominantly in this video, I was responding to David's video. So I'm not saying that there's no other responses other than those that are being presented here, but I can't respond to everything in one video. So if you think that there are other videos that I should respond to relating to this, feel free to add them as a comment to the YouTube video. Putting them in chat here is a bit trickier. But yeah, happy to take suggestions if there's other things that people think I should be respond to. I think that might be about it. The mobile meat suit gives you advanced sensors. Soul by itself is only shitty soul eyes. That's why you guys can never actually read the hidden note. And could be right. Like it's like a downgrade. It's the it's like in a video game, right? Where you spawn with only the most basic equipment, and then you like gradually level up and get better equipment. So, when the soul spawns, it has only the base level loadouts, and then it gets a body, and then its body grows, and I mean, because everyone knows that the soul joins the body at fertilization, so it's just a zygote at that point. I mean, there's not much there. It gradually has to grow and actually obtain eyes and ears and limbs and all this other stuff, and then but when you're born, it's still mostly useless because you don't know actually how to use any of those things. So you've got to like level up as you go through life. It's kind of annoying that it takes a good 25 years for a body to be, particularly the brain, to be fully leveled up and ready to go. And then just as you're there, it starts to deteriorate. So it's a really underwhelming gameplay experience. Like there's a huge amount of grind at the start, and then just as you're getting good, you start to deteriorate, and it's like you're leveling down again. So I think we should seriously think about having a word with like the designer, God, presumably, and talking about like a patch or something to improve the gameplay experience, because like pretty objectively there's some design problems here. You should do one on Emerson's videos. They're actually pretty clever, clean. Yeah, okay, I'll have a look. The match is called Theosis. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, so in regards to the NDE, so this is the standard believer response. It's like, oh, everything they said has been debunked, which they say without debunking anything. Anyway, if there's actually substantive responses there, then I'll have a look. But if it's just more of that, then I'm inclined not to actually bother. All right. Last chance if you have a burning question, which I can address now. Otherwise, I'm going to get going. So yeah, let me just do some announcements. So Nathan and I have a couple of videos scheduled. One on mental representations and related issues. So I'm sure we'll talk about some of these issues there and try to show Nathan the error of his behaviorist ways. And we also have, what's the other one, Nathan, we have? It's Dominion. Yeah, so the whole like apologetic, everything good in Western civilization has, it comes out of Christianity kind of shtick. So we're going to be talking about that one. So those are two bad apologetics episodes will be coming up in the next month or so. And David Pallmann, whose video I'm responding to here, has also agreed to chat with me about substance dualism. So I said, let's wait until I've done the part 2. So this is the part 2. So hopefully we'll be able to schedule something again in the next month or so. So that will be coming up. Well, cognitive science is fake and I'm like Gala being persecuted. Yeah, pretty much. And in terms of, so I might check out Emerson's videos that have been recommended on philosophy of mind. So that sounds good. Oh, I should probably announce something here as well, actually, for those of you who watch this. So in about 6 weeks or so, hopefully, if the visa comes through, I'm going to be moving to the US to start a postdoc in subsequent to my PhD, which I'm just sort of finishing up. So I'll be researching language acquisition, like computational models of language acquisition and analyzing some neuroimaging data. So the main upshot of that is that I will be streaming at different times. So I'll be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So is that Eastern Standard Time or is that Central Time? I can't remember. But the point is that the time zones will magically shift, and so I don't know if that's going to be good or bad for you guys, but just letting you know, I'll probably make a community post about that now that I think of it. So you don't think I've suddenly adopted a bizarre sleep schedule. All right, that's probably all the announcements we need for now. So thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found that interesting, and take care. I'll see you next time.